We all know that being a ruler sounds grand. Palaces, robes, power stretching across lands. But imagine rising before dawn, every footstep in your palace noted, every breath weighed, with an empire waiting for your decision before the sun even rises. Fatigue, scrutiny, and devotion collide in every moment. In today's video, we'll talk about what it's truly like to spend just 24 hours as a caliph in the Umayyad Empire. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. The pre-dawn call to duty. You sense the attendants before you fully hear them. Soft footfalls gliding across marble, measured and muted so as not to disturb your rest. Even their silence feels intentional, part of the ritual of waking a caliph. You lie still for a moment, eyes half opened, listening to the gentle stirrings of a palace already preparing for your rise. Long before the sun touches Damascus, long before the city exhales its first breath of morning, the world inside these walls is already moving. The air is cool, carrying the faint scent of rosewater from the courtyard fountains. Somewhere far beyond your chamber, a single door closes with a respectful hush. Another opens. Robes whisper. Sandals barely touch the floor. Even in this early hour, nothing is careless. Every motion is deliberate, practiced, orderly, because the caliph must not be woken abruptly, must not be greeted by chaos, must not be reminded that the empire outside is anything less than serene. You sit up slowly, the linens falling softly from your shoulders. The attendants pause in the doorway until they see that you are fully awake. Only then do they approach, offering quiet greetings with lowered eyes. Their presence alone reminds you, every gesture you make, every breath you take is observed by someone. Not judged, perhaps, but noted, remembered. Carried through the palace like a whispered report. A faint breeze enters from the open lattice window, carrying the first hints of dawn, but the sky is still dark, still waiting. Then, a sound rises through the courtyard, the muezzin's voice, clear, measured, resonant. The adhan unfurls across the palace like a ribbon of devotion, threading through stone archways and sleeping gardens, calling every soul, even the most powerful, to humility. The melodic rise and fall of it touches your chest in a way that is both grounding and overwhelming. It is the call that begins the entire empire's day. And today, impossibly, it is calling you. The attendants stop what they are doing. For a moment, the entire palace seems to hold its breath, allowing the sacred words to move unhindered through the air. You close your eyes, letting the sound wash over you. It is beautiful, solemn, steady, and it reminds you that your new role is not merely political, but spiritual. The caliph is expected to embody devotion, wisdom, and steadiness, even when no one is watching. And here, someone is always watching. When the final phrase of the adhan fades into the pre-dawn stillness, the attendants resume their gentle activity. One lays fresh garments near your bed. Another prepares a lantern to guide you through the halls. A third steps back and bows slightly, waiting for you to rise. You stand, though your legs feel strangely heavy with the weight of expectation. Perhaps anyone would feel such heaviness, awakening as the symbolic heart of an empire stretched across continents. As you move across the cool marble floor, the attendants follow a respectful distance behind you, their footsteps soft enough to be mistaken for a passing breeze. The corridors are dim, lit only by small recessed oil lamps casting warm pools of gold along the walls. Dates and pomegranate motifs shimmer faintly in carved wooden screens. Fountains murmur in distant courtyards. The palace at this hour feels more like a sanctum than a seat of power, as if the world has not yet remembered that it demands anything of you. And yet, it does. It always does. You sense it in the stillness, the constant hum beneath the silence, decisions waiting, voices expecting, duties gathering like shadows behind each doorway. Even the attendants seem to carry that awareness in their movements, as though they are escorting not merely a person, but a role so large it could swallow a lifetime whole. A narrow archway leads you toward the courtyard reserved for your morning purification. The air grows cooler, touched by the breath of the fountain ahead. A faint mist rises from its basin, catching what little light exists before dawn. You hear the gentle movement of water, steady and soothing, the sound echoing faintly against stone. An attendant steps forward, gesturing toward the basin. Another holds a folded cloth. Their faces remain composed, respectful, patient. This moment, your ritual of preparation, is not simply habit. It is ceremony, discipline, a reminder that before you face advisors, generals, or petitioners, you must first face stillness. As you enter the open courtyard, the sky above has begun to pale, slightly, a thin wash of silver along the horizon. Not sunrise yet, but its quiet promise. You take a breath, preparing to begin the purification that will mark the true start of your day. Ablution in the early courtyard at dawn still clung to the sky in shades of violet and soft gold as you stepped into the courtyard. The air carried the delicate scent of dew on stone, mingled with the faint aroma of herbs from the garden beyond. Before you, a fountain carved from pale stone awaited, its basin still and glimmering, reflecting the earliest light like a polished mirror. The sound of water trickling over sculpted spouts was gentle but deliberate, as if each drop counted. Attendants had already gathered at a respectful distance. Their eyes followed your every movement, not with curiosity, but with expectation. A quiet tension lingered, an unspoken acknowledgement that this ritual demanded more than mere habit. Every motion, every gesture of purification was weighed against tradition and precedent, as though the courtyard itself were a living witness. You approached the fountain, inhaling the crisp morning air. Leaning forward, your hands met the water. Shock coursed through you at its chill, sharp enough to draw a sharp intake of breath. The coldness was bracing, a tangible reminder that devotion required not comfort, but awareness. As your hands moved through the water, cupping and lifting it to rinse face and arms, the attendant's presence became both a reassurance and a subtle challenge. Each motion had to be precise, each gesture deliberate. The steps of ablution unfolded like a quiet choreography, washing the hands, rinsing the mouth and nose, cleansing the face, arms, head, and feet. With each movement, you felt the weight of ritual settle over your shoulders. There was something sacred in the repetition, a rhythm that made the cold water and solemn gazes feel almost protective rather than intrusive. You could sense the courtyard exhaling with you, the fountains murmuring approval at each careful, correct motion. Yet, beneath the serenity, A tension simmered. It was not fear of error, but the responsibility of example. Soon, the first prayers would rise, and you would lead. Every bead of water, sliding over skin, was a reminder that devotion was both personal and communal, a dance between inner sincerity and outward dignity. Even in solitude, you were never truly alone. The attendants murmured softly among themselves, adjusting garments or shifting in silence, their presence almost imperceptible, yet undeniably felt. You caught a fleeting glance at one of them, whose eyes held a quiet reverence. It was an acknowledgement. This act, this early hour of devotion, was not merely preparation for prayer, but a statement of your place in a continuum that stretched back centuries. Finally, hands and face cleansed, feet rinsed, you paused to look around. The courtyard, emptied of its earlier shadows, felt alive. Sunlight began to spill over the fountain's pale stone, igniting 1,000 glints on the water's surface. In the stillness, the ritual had transformed you. The chill, the scrutiny, the precise motions, all now merged into a singular clarity of purpose. Rising from the fountain, you wrapped the water from your hands into a final gesture of blessing, a quiet invocation that carried both humility and intent. This was the threshold. Ahead, the hall awaited for the first formal prayers of the day, and with them, the mantle of guidance you were to bear. The courtyard, now a witness rather than a participant, fell into silence, leaving only the echo of dripping water and your own steady breath. With one last glance at the pale fountain, you stepped toward the hall. Each stride felt measured, deliberate, infused with the gravity of early devotion. You were ready, not only to perform the ritual of prayer, but to lead it, to weave the serene cadence of your own discipline into the rhythm of the full community. In the quiet dawn, between stone and water, the first spark of authority and responsibility had taken root, gentle but unyielding. The dawn prayer and the eyes of the court. The hall awaited, its high arches catching the pale morning light that had spilled from the courtyard. You entered quietly, your footsteps muffled on the polished stone floor. Scholars in flowing robes, guards in disciplined formation, and nobles draped in silks already filled the space, their murmurs fading as you took your place. Every pair of eyes, some curious, some deferential, seemed to settle upon you, measuring. In this hall, even stillness was scrutinized, even breathing was observed. You positioned yourself at the head of the assembly, aware that every posture, every gesture, would be noticed. The calm you had cultivated at the fountain of the courtyard now faced a heavier test. The weight of expectation pressed down, not with harshness, but with insistence. A caliph must embody devotion, and here, in the eyes of the court, that embodiment was visible and immediate. The call to prayer filled the hall, a soft, resonant intonation that drew the mind inward, urging focus and humility. You inhaled, letting the rhythm of the dawn fill your chest. The earlier chill of water, still a faint echo on your skin. As the congregation bent and prostrated, the ceremony's serene cadence enveloped you. Within the ritual, there was peace. The worries of palace intrigue, of politics and precedence, softened, if only for a heartbeat. Yet, the awareness of your role never entirely lifted. Every movement was a statement, every intonation a model. To falter here was not merely a personal lapse. It would ripple outward, observed and remembered. Your hands rose in the opening gesture, palms facing heaven, the simple act magnified by significance. Each bow, each prostration, carried a weight beyond its physicality. You felt the eyes of the court in the periphery of your awareness, the scholars noting precision of movement, the guards registering discipline, the nobles weighing dignity and devotion. Even as serenity rooted itself in your heart, the court's gaze traced every breath. For a moment, the hall seemed to shrink and expand simultaneously. Within the ritual, you were alone with the divine, yet at the same time, 1,000 unseen judgments pressed upon your shoulders. Still, you moved with care, attuned to both prayer and presence. The rhythm of invocation and response flowed naturally, the cadence anchoring you, even as the consciousness of others lingered like a shadow at the edge of awareness. When the prayer concluded, there was a subtle shift in the air. The scholars returned to quiet study, the guards to their vigilant watch, the nobles to whispered conversations. And yet, the hall had left its mark. You had fulfilled your duty. You had modeled the devotion expected of a caliph. A wave of relief mingled with the solemnity of responsibility. Though the ritual had ended, the lessons it reinforced, the necessity of poise, presence, and the fusion of inner devotion with outward example, would linger throughout the day. Attendants approached, escorting you through the hall's polished corridors toward the palace's private chambers. Here, the ceremonial weight eased, replaced by the intimate rituals of dressing and preparation. Silks were adjusted, collars straightened, and ornaments settled into place. Every movement, though private, was performed with precision, a quiet continuation of the discipline displayed in the hall. As you prepared, in the quietude of the chambers, the morning's ritual continued to echo within you. The cold water, the attentive eyes, the measured breaths of prayer, all had conspired to awaken a deeper awareness, not merely of devotion, but of leadership, responsibility, and the delicate balance between humility and authority. Each layer of preparation, physical, spiritual, ceremonial, had built toward this moment, and yet it was only the beginning. Stepping from the chambers, now fully arrayed in the regalia of office, you felt the duality of existence. A caliph, both human and exemplar, called to embody faith and command simultaneously. The corridors of the palace stretched ahead, promising tasks, counsel, and encounters that would test the equilibrium of piety and power. Behind you, the echoes of the dawn prayer lingered like a quiet hymn, a reminder that every gesture, every decision, would resonate far beyond the immediate. In this threshold between ritual and daily duty, you sensed the invisible gaze of the court yet again. Not with judgment now, but with expectation, anticipation, and perhaps a measure of hope. The day had begun, and with it, the true work of presence, leadership, and devotion awaited. Dressing in layers of authority, The palace corridors felt warmer now, the sunlight spilling through latticed windows and casting lattices of gold and shadow on the polished floors. You had left behind the intimacy of the ablution chamber and the solemnity of the dawn prayer, but the echo of ritual still clung to your senses. Each step forward was measured, deliberate, a reminder that the morning had already begun its quiet assessment of your bearing and resolve. Before you, a series of garments awaited, folded and draped with meticulous care, fabrics that carried histories as weighty as the palace stones themselves. Fine wool, silk, and cotton in shades both muted and commanding were arranged across low tables, each color, cut, and drape conveying a silent language of authority and lineage. This was not mere dressing. It was an enactment of office, a physical manifestation of the mantle you bore. Servants moved with practiced precision, their hands steady and unobtrusive. A belt was adjusted here, a fold smoothed there, a turban wrapped with careful attention to symmetry. Each motion reinforced the symbolism inherent in the attire, the authority of your position, the continuity of tradition, the balance between dignity and accessibility. The fabrics pressed against your skin, heavier than expected, not in weight, but in implication. They were a constant reminder that leadership was never light. It demanded presence, awareness, and a willingness to embody both expectation and example. As the layers accumulated, you felt the transformation. The individual beneath the garments had not vanished, but had been reframed, framed in the language of duty and ceremony. A subtle rigidity crept into posture, a measured grace into movement. Where earlier, at the fountain, the focus had been inward, now it was outward. The assembly of robes, belts, and turbans was a dialogue with the court, a visual assertion of preparedness and legitimacy. Mirrors inlaid with mother-of-pearl reflected the careful arrangements. You caught glimpses of yourself and felt the duality of perception, the eyes that saw only fabric and form, and the eyes that would soon interpret meaning from every gesture, every step. The weight of expectation was tangible now, pressing lightly at your shoulders, even as the morning sun lent warmth to the chambers. Each layer added, each fold arranged, felt like a rehearsal for the public act of leadership that awaited beyond the doors. The attendants stepped back at last, allowing a final inspection. A turban had been straightened, a sash adjusted, robes allowed to drape naturally yet deliberately. The transformation was complete, not only dressed, but armored in authority. Every thread a declaration of purpose and responsibility. In the quiet pause, you sensed the gravity of the morning ritual extending into the day ahead. The council, the audience, the duties that would test poise and judgment alike. When the first steps toward the council chamber were taken, the palace seemed to shift in response. Doors opened with subtle ceremony, corridors widened in perception, and the light shifted to catch the folds of your robes in a way that was both flattering and commanding. Every footfall was measured, a rhythm that resonated with the discipline instilled in the early courtyard, carried through the dawn prayer, and now translated into the visual language of leadership. Ahead, advisors awaited, seated with papers, tablets, and pens laid out in readiness. Their gaze, attentive and expectant, followed your progress as you entered the chamber. The atmosphere was dense with anticipation. Discussion, counsel, and deliberation would soon flow. But before words could be exchanged, the silent dialogue of authority had already spoken. The layers of wool, silk, and cotton had communicated what words could not. That the office had been assumed with awareness, care, and dignity. A servant offered a final adjustment, a belt straightened, a sleeve smoothed, and you inclined your head in quiet acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, yet it carried significance. A reminder that leadership required attentiveness not only to matters of state, but to the details that signaled respect, decorum, and continuity. The garments you wore were more than cloth. They were symbols, a daily rehearsal of presence and responsibility that would precede, accompany, and ultimately inform every decision you made. And so, fully arrayed in layers that weighed more in expectation than in fabric, you took your place at the head of the council chamber. Scholars, advisors, and officials settled their gaze upon you, prepared for instruction, deliberation, and guidance. In that moment, the ceremonial rituals of the morning, the cold water, the focused breaths, the measured prayers, and the careful dressing converged into a singular understanding. The day had begun, and with it, the work of leadership, in all its subtle, demanding complexity, had already commenced. The morning council convenes. The doors of the council chamber closed with a quiet authority behind you, sealing the hall in a calm that was more anticipatory than still. The sunlight streaming through latticed windows caught the folds of your robes, casting lines of gold and shadow across the polished floor. Before you, the Diwan was already assembled, scholars in flowing robes, military commanders in disciplined formation, tax officials with scrolls and ledgers, emissaries from distant regions, poised with careful dignity. Each figure carried the weight of their office in posture and expression, and each glance toward you carried a subtle inquiry. The Caliph has risen, and now the work of empire begins. You took your place at the head of the long, low table. The murmurs that had accompanied their settling faded into attentive silence. It was a silence thick with expectation, yet measured, as though the chamber itself exhaled only when the assembly deemed the time appropriate. In this quiet, you sensed the full gravity of your position. Every decision, every word, every nod or pause would ripple outward, shaping the lives of millions across vast lands and diverse peoples. The council began with formalities, acknowledgments, greetings, the subtle ritual of seating and gestures. Even in these small movements, the political weight was palpable. As scholars adjusted their notes, military leaders straightened in their chairs, and emissaries shifted with quiet deference. You felt the delicate tension between tradition and pragmatism, between the ritual of governance and its relentless demands. Here, every posture and every inflection mattered. The first report was laid before you, a summary of taxation across the northern provinces. Figures, charts, and annotations covered the page, but the real message was in the nuances. Anomalies, trends, and signs of unrest subtly indicated where attention, guidance, or intervention might be required. You listened as the finance officer spoke, noting the careful phrasing, the respect in measured words, and the understated urgency behind statistics. Each sentence reminded you that the empire was alive, a vast network of lives and resources that responded to your guidance with both fidelity and fragility. Military commanders followed, presenting updates from distant garrisons. Their words were clipped, disciplined, yet beneath the surface ran currents of concern. Supply lines disrupted by weather, skirmishes requiring vigilance, morale maintained through both authority and subtle diplomacy. Each report was a test of attention, judgment, and the capacity to balance immediate action with strategic foresight. You recognized the duality of leadership: to command decisively, yet listen with care; to act swiftly, yet weigh consequence. Scholars offered insights on religious matters, interpreting precedents, and clarifying legal questions that might affect policy across the provinces. Their knowledge was profound, their delivery careful. But you understood the underlying pressure. Their words shaped the moral as well as administrative contours of governance. Emissaries, eyes steady but attentive, reminded you that your authority reached beyond the walls of the palace, across lands, cultures, and courts where your reputation preceded your actions. The room seemed to breathe with tension and purpose. Every hand that rested upon parchment, every eye that met yours, reinforced the enormity of expectation. You were no longer simply a participant in ritual or devotion. Here, the ritual was governance itself. The cadence of voices, the formal yet restrained exchange of information, created a rhythm that demanded attention, decisiveness, and foresight in equal measure. Despite the weight pressing on your shoulders, there was clarity in the order of the council. Reports flowed methodically from one official to another, each question answered with precision, each concern acknowledged with measured reflection. Within the structured cadence, you felt the subtle pulse of leadership, awareness of human and logistical limits, the need to anticipate consequences, the necessity of balancing justice, mercy, and strategy. As the council moved from immediate affairs to reports arriving from distant provinces, your attention sharpened. Scrolls were unfurled, envoys read aloud, and maps spread across the table. Each message carried the voices of those far from the palace. Governors noting crop failures, sheriffs detailing local unrest, commanders requesting reinforcements. The scope of empire pressed close, yet within it lay the quiet understanding that your presence, your judgment, and your capacity to guide would hold it together. By the time the first reports concluded, the chamber was a living network of information and expectation. Every individual in the council understood the weight of their role, just as you understood the responsibility to interpret, adjudicate, and lead. The day had shifted fully into administration, and the empire awaited the guidance that only a caliph, poised in devotion, attire, and discernment, could provide. Messages from the edges of the empire. The council's earlier deliberations had set the rhythm of the morning, yet the true breadth of your responsibility revealed itself only when the couriers arrived. They entered the chamber with careful ceremony, scrolls in hand, each bearing news from the furthest reaches of the empire. From the deserts of North Africa to the plains of Persia, from the rugged mountains of Anatolia to the fertile valleys along the great rivers, These messages traced the arteries of a realm both vast and intricate. The first scroll was unrolled, the parchment crackling softly in the hushed chamber. Governor's reports detailed border disputes with neighboring tribes, each paragraph layered with cautious language, warnings, and requests for guidance. The words were precise, diplomatic, yet carried the unspoken urgency of potential conflict. As you listened, absorbing each nuance, a sense of scale pressed upon your consciousness. The empire was not abstract. It was alive in every village, caravan, and frontier outpost, dependent upon decisions made here, in this sunlit hall. A second courier delivered word of a tribal negotiation, its outcome delicate and fragile. One misstep, one misjudged tone could unravel months of tentative agreements. The messenger's eyes, disciplined but attentive, reflected the gravity of your role. Each decision you would make from this chamber would travel faster than the scroll itself, carried in the actions, loyalties, and whispers of those who governed far from the palace walls. You unrolled the third scroll. It contained appeals from regions afflicted by poor harvests and intermittent unrest. Governors asked for reinforcements, financial relief, and sometimes personal intervention. You read each request carefully, aware that a swift judgment might bring relief, or inadvertently sow resentment. Even as the words were written, you could feel the ripple of impact stretching across mountains, deserts, and rivers. Every choice demanded foresight, sensitivity, and an understanding of the human lives tethered to your authority. The sheer geographical scale of the empire staggered you. North Africa, with its sun-scorched lands and coastal cities. The Levant, a nexus of trade and tribal alliances. The fertile valleys of Mesopotamia. The distant Persian frontiers, where languages and customs differed, yet authority was uniform. Each scroll, each message, a thread in a web that spanned continents. And each thread pulled on the one that rested heavily across your shoulders. Responsibility. As the couriers filed one after another, the intensity of governance became palpable. You leaned forward, tracing names, locations, and decisions with a mind attempting to chart both immediate action and long-term consequence. The council's advisors murmured observations, offered counsel, and reminded you of precedents. But the weight of final judgment rested squarely on your own understanding. Here, the balance between justice, prudence, and expedience was not a matter of philosophy alone. It was survival, stability, and legitimacy for millions. Each scroll also reminded you of the subtle politics underlying administration. Tribes with long-standing feuds, governors with personal ambitions, and distant communities whose loyalty was tentative all required consideration. Every word on parchment could become a catalyst for peace or discord. The calm of the dawn prayer and the careful layering of robes in your private chambers now seemed distant echoes, replaced by the relentless demands of leadership that required both clarity and foresight. And yet, amid the weight, there was clarity. The methodical unrolling of scrolls, the careful note-taking, and the consultations with advisors created a rhythm that, while taxing, was deeply purposeful. It was a moment where the empire's immensity could be felt in tangible form, where the human labor, ambition, and hope of thousands of officials and subjects converged through ink and parchment onto a single table before you. Hours passed in careful deliberation. Decisions were made, notes taken for later discussion, and instructions dispatched for urgent action. The process left a residue of mental strain that, though invigorating in its significance, demanded acknowledgement. Even a caliph, bound by ritual, devotion, and authority, could not sustain such intensity without brief reprieve. As the final scrolls were collected and the last couriers excused, you leaned back in your seat, allowing yourself a moment of stillness. The morning's work had spanned continents and crises, yet the weight of the empire was constant, pressing both upon your mind and into your very posture. A pause, however brief, was not indulgence. It was necessity, a moment to gather strength before the next phase of duty. From the edges of the empire to the center of the palace, the day had expanded, yet there remained a heartbeat of pause, a quiet interval to reclaim composure. The mind demanded it, the body welcomed it, and the empire, patient in its reach, allowed it. In that brief respite, you could feel the transition approaching. A moment of personal care and reflection before the next set of obligations would claim your attention, guiding naturally toward the need to step aside, even temporarily, from the relentless pulse of governance. A moment in the private garden, the palace corridors, polished and echoing with the rhythm of administrative footsteps, gradually gave way to a quieter path. Servants guided you through an arched doorway and down a series of shaded arcades, the morning's intensity lingering in your shoulders like a weight reluctantly loosened. Ahead lay the private garden, a carefully cultivated refuge hidden within the palace walls. Its serenity a stark contrast to the measured rigor of council and scrolls. Sunlight filtered through branches heavy with citrus fruit, scattering warm patches of gold across the paved walkways. Fountains gurgled softly, their clear water spilling over sculpted basins and creating a rhythm that seemed both deliberate and incidental, a private heartbeat of the palace. The scent of blossoms and citrus mingled, sweet and subtle, offering a momentary reprieve from the pressing concerns of empire. You inhaled deeply, allowing yourself a fragment of calm, though your mind remained alert, attentive to the ever-present expectations surrounding you. Even here, the presence of guards reminded you that tranquility was never complete. They lingered at the edges of arcades, attentive yet unobtrusive. Shadows against the sunlight, a constant reminder that security and duty followed wherever you went. Their silent vigilance underscored the duality of this space, both sanctuary and stage. You could walk, pause, and breathe, yet the weight of position remained, an invisible companion threading through the garden's fragrant calm. You moved along the garden paths, noting the careful arrangement of flora and water features. Marble benches, strategically placed beneath citrus trees, invited pause, and shaded alcoves offered privacy even within these walls. It was a garden designed not merely for beauty, but for reflection, a place where thoughts could be organized, if only momentarily, before the next set of duties arrived. You lowered yourself onto a bench, the cool marble grounding you against the morning sun's warmth. For a few minutes, the mind wandered, briefly considering personal matters, the rhythm of prayers yet to come, the distant provinces now resolved or deferred, the courtyards, the council chamber, and the endless flow of reports felt distant, yet the memory of their gravity remained. Even as you focused on the gurgling fountains and the scent of blossoms, your thoughts circled around decisions already made, outcomes yet unknown, and the subtle diplomacy that required constant attention. A soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead, carrying the quiet promise of a slower pace. Yet even here, the world beyond the garden persisted. You could hear the faint shuffle of footsteps along stone corridors, the distant murmur of attendants, and the occasional clink of a vessel as water was poured. The garden's hush, though profound, was not absolute. It allowed reflection, but never full retreat. It was a space to breathe, yet not to escape. Your gaze wandered to the fountains, their water reflecting sunlight in glittering patterns across the marble. The careful interplay of light and shadow, water and stone seemed almost symbolic. Order imposed on fluidity, structure on movement. You felt a subtle alignment between the garden's deliberate design and the discipline of governance. Both demanded attentiveness, foresight, and care. Even in moments of respite, awareness could not be abandoned. Minutes passed, marked only by the soft plash of water and the occasional rustle of citrus leaves. The garden offered peace, but it also reminded you of preparation, of continuity, and of the endless responsibilities that awaited beyond its arcades. Inhale, exhale, steady the mind. Even brief respite was practice, a rehearsal for presence, poise, and clarity before the next engagement demanded them. Then, the hush of the garden shifted. Footsteps approached along the stone path, crisp and purposeful. The rustle of robes and the subtle echo of careful shoes on marble announced that your private moment was nearing its end. Attendants, guards, or perhaps advisors, each step reminded you that duty never paused, that the world beyond these trees and fountains awaited. You rose from the bench, brushing marble dust from robes layered for authority, and allowed the garden's calm to linger quietly within you, like a whisper carried into the coming day. With a final glance at the citrus trees, the shaded alcoves, and the fountains that had offered a fleeting sanctuary, you stepped toward the approaching footsteps. The serenity of the garden receded, replaced by the cadence of obligation, duty, and expectation. The morning's rituals, councils, and administrative labors had converged into this single interval of reflection. But the day would continue, demanding focus, judgment, and the unceasing presence of leadership, petitioners at the gate. The brief tranquility of the private garden faded behind you as palace corridors once again guided your steps toward the outer hall. The sunlight streaming through latticed windows now felt sharper, brighter, a reminder that the day pressed forward. Beyond the inner chambers, beyond the shaded arcades and fountains, awaited a new test of authority. The voices of the people, gathered at the palace gate with petitions that only you could resolve. The hall at the entrance was already alive with motion. Courtiers, guards, and stewards maintained order, but the faces of the petitioners told their own stories. Lines of worry, hope, and quiet expectation etched into brows and eyes. Some knelt with humility, others stood with measured dignity. All carried burdens that only the Caliph could address. Each scroll, folded note, or verbal plea arrived with a weight heavier than its paper suggested. Here, abstract governance became intensely personal, each encounter a microcosm of empire. The first petitioner approached, a farmer seeking relief for crops lost to sudden flood. His voice was earnest but strained, his hands gripping the scroll as if it were both shield and supplication. You listened, noting the precision of his account and the sincerity in every word. Offering fairness required more than adherence to precedent. It demanded empathy, attention, and a deep understanding of both law and human circumstance. The responsibility pressed on your chest, tangible and immediate, heavier than any robe or crown. Next came a merchant, traveling from a distant city, requesting adjudication over a trade dispute that could have repercussions for local markets and distant provinces alike. His concerns were meticulous, rooted in contracts and custom, and he delivered them with a careful respect that mirrored your own ceremonial precision. Even in this brief exchange, the complexity of leadership became clear. Every decision set precedent, shaped perception, and resonated across regions that you had never physically visited, yet were bound to in duty and law. A mother brought a petition for mercy on behalf of her son, accused of a crime whose circumstances were as delicate as the ink on her letter. Her plea was quiet, almost trembling, but unmistakably urgent. In the span of minutes, the range of human concern pressed upon you. Justice, mercy, economic stability, and social cohesion all threaded through these encounters. To respond justly was not merely to recite law, but to balance hearts, circumstances, and the broader arc of governance. Each petitioner reminded you of the multiplicity of authority, the Caliph as judge, protector, and arbiter, the Caliph as symbol, both approachable and formidable. Even as you listened attentively, the gaze of the palace and the eyes of the court remained at the edge of awareness. Every nod, every question, every decision would ripple outward, carried by scribes, attendants, and word of mouth to distant towns and villages. Each story added weight to the mantle you wore so carefully in layers of cloth and ceremony. The procession continued, unbroken yet measured. Requests for trade regulation, appeals against local governors, clarifications of religious or civic law, pleas for protection from tribal disputes. They formed a steady stream, each distinct, each demanding unique consideration. In responding, you drew upon counsel where appropriate, balancing precedent, principle, and the immediate human realities before you. Even as decisions were made, you felt the silent pressure of observation. The attendants, the guards, and the court all noting method, tone, and discernment. It was a rhythm both taxing and illuminating. The petitions, in their variety, reminded you that authority was not abstract. It was enacted in moments of encounter, in listening, adjudicating, and responding with fairness. Each story carried a fragment of the empire itself, from fertile fields and bustling markets to quiet towns and distant desert settlements. Every decision, every nod of acknowledgement reinforced the delicate balance between law, mercy, and perception. By the time the last petitioner had been heard, the hall felt both emptied and charged, a silence heavy with the accumulated weight of lives, expectations, and consequences. The stories lingered in your mind, reminding you of the human texture that underlay governance, faces, voices, and burdens that were inseparable from the policies, edicts, and ceremonies that defined your role. From the gate, attendants guided you through the palace corridors once more, leading toward the judicial chamber. Here, the work of adjudication would continue in a more formal setting where laws, counsel, and precedent converged into structured rulings. The gate had offered you immediacy, intimacy, and urgency. The chamber promised deliberation, codification, and the formal assertion of authority. One step after another, you moved forward, aware that the day's responsibilities were unbroken, yet that each stage, like the garden or the council, offered its own rhythm, challenges, and lessons. The Caliph as judge. Leaving the bustle of the palace gate behind, the attendants guided you through the corridors with quiet efficiency, their footsteps echoing softly against stone. You passed through arched passageways and polished halls, each turn bringing you closer to the grand chamber where the formal work of justice would be enacted. The petitions you had received at the gate now assumed structure, organized into cases that demanded careful consideration, precedent, and discernment. The hall itself was vast, its high ceilings carved with intricate arabesques, allowing sunlight to spill through the latticed windows and illuminate rows of scholars and legal experts awaiting your arrival. Their presence was both reassuring and a reminder. You were not alone in this endeavor, yet the final judgment rested with you. They offered prepared notes, citations of prior rulings, and interpretations of law, all at the ready, a silent acknowledgement that the Caliph's authority was exercised not in isolation, but in dialogue with expertise. Cases began methodically. A property dispute opened the session. Two families contested ownership of farmland along a disputed boundary. The legal scholars recited contracts, maps, and witness accounts while you listened, weighing testimony with both fairness and practical foresight. Every word was significant, every nuance a potential pivot between resolution and grievance. Even with the counsel of learned men beside you, the responsibility to judge with impartiality pressed heavily. Decisions were not merely about law. They were about lives, livelihoods, and the reputation of your authority. Next came personal grievances, claims of slander, accusations of theft, and appeals for restitution. Each story carried its own weight, often delicate and emotionally charged. Listening carefully, you began to sense the strain of constant fairness. Empathy, precision, and awareness had to coexist in perfect balance. The exhaustion was subtle at first, a quiet pressure behind the temples, but it mounted steadily with each case. Fairness was not abstract. It required vigilance, clarity, and the ability to suppress neither judgment nor compassion. As cases unfolded, patterns emerged. Some disputes were straightforward, resolvable through precedent and evidence. Others were entangled with local customs, familial obligations, or subtle political considerations. The scholars offered interpretations, citing laws and prior decisions. Yet the final articulation, the pronouncement that carried both authority and consequence, was yours. Each declaration shaped the perception of justice within the empire, reinforcing the delicate equilibrium between governance and human expectation. The rhythm of adjudication was intense. Questions were posed, evidence examined, and arguments clarified. Every pause, nod, or inflection in your voice was noted, consciously or not, by those assembled. Even in moments of calm, the weight of authority lingered. The day's work was cumulative. The cold water of dawn, the layered robes of office, the council, the petitions, all led to this point, where judgment was distilled into decision, principle, and precedent. Occasionally, a case required consultation or deferral. The scholars would provide additional insight, witnesses would be recalled, and you would deliberate silently, weighing moral, legal, and practical considerations. The concentration demanded was exhausting, the mind constantly shifting between empathy, legality, and long-term consequence, felt the strain more acutely with each successive case. Yet in this exhaustion was clarity. Leadership required not only presence, but sustained discernment, a capacity to navigate the intricate weave of human society and institutional expectation. Hours passed in careful deliberation. Cases resolved, disputes mediated, and judgments pronounced. The chamber gradually settled into quiet. Attendants moved to collect notes, scrolls, and records, filing them for continuity and reference. The scholars, their work complete for the morning, offered deferential bows and murmurs of acknowledgement. You, though weary, felt the steady satisfaction of duty fulfilled, the subtle affirmation that fairness, however taxing, had been upheld. As the court adjourned, attendants approached once more, guiding you gently from the grand hall. The sun had climbed higher in the sky, light spilling into the corridors and hinting at warmth, sustenance, and rest. Ahead awaited the midday meal, a brief interlude before the afternoon duties would resume. Even as your body anticipated relief, your mind carried the lessons of the morning, the exhaustion inherent in fairness, the subtle weight of judgment, and the realization that authority was a constant dialogue between action, consequence, and conscience. With measured steps, you followed the attendants, each corridor bringing you closer to refreshment in the quiet interval before the empire once again claimed your attention. The Caliph's day, relentless yet structured, flowed onward, a continuous thread of ritual, judgment, and responsibility, woven seamlessly into the rhythm of palace life, the midday meal, and quiet conversations. Attendants guided you from the grand hall of justice through a series of cool, shaded corridors, the sunlight softening as it filtered through latticed windows. The weight of morning deliberations clung to your shoulders, and the promise of the midday meal offered both sustenance and a brief, measured pause. The palace's dining chamber awaited, arranged with care, low tables, cushions of rich fabric, and platters of food meant not only to nourish, but to uphold the rhythms and rituals of daily life. The meal began simply yet deliberately. Dates, dark and sweet, were set in small bowls, alongside flatbread still warm from the oven. Roasted meats, tender and fragrant, were accompanied by olives and cool water infused with sprigs of mint and other herbs. The scents mingled subtly, grounding you in the tangible pleasures of nourishment, even as the day's responsibilities lingered at the edges of awareness. Eating became a careful ritual, deliberate bites, mindful chewing. The hands and posture observed by attendants whose presence was simultaneously protective and quietly scrutinizing. Advisors gathered around, their approach informal yet measured, aware that even in repose, conversation carried weight. One scholar murmured an interpretation of recent legal precedents, while a tax official hinted at adjustments in provincial levies. A military commander commented on troop movements with casual phrasing, though beneath it lay a suggestion of strategic urgency. Even the most relaxed discussion was embedded with meaning. Subtle reminders of loyalty, expectation, and political nuance that required constant attention. You longed for simplicity, for the freedom to eat, drink, and rest without observation. Yet that freedom remained elusive. Each word, each nod, each bite taken or left aside was noted, consciously or unconsciously, by those around you. Even the act of drinking, cool water carrying hints of mint, lemon, or sage, became a quiet ritual of attention, a reminder that presence and poise were inseparable from sustenance. The palace's rhythms allowed little space for unobserved thought. Even in moments of physical nourishment, mental vigilance persisted. Yet the meal offered more than obligation. Between bites and sips, there were intervals of reflection, subtle pauses where the morning's decisions could be revisited and the empire's pressing matters considered anew. A brief observation from a scholar might prompt a reconsideration of legal phrasing. A report from a commander could illuminate an overlooked angle of strategy. The meal, though communal and informal in tone, became an extension of governance, a space where attentiveness to detail and human nuance intertwined with the simple act of eating. Conversation flowed gently, moderated by your presence. Advisors spoke with respect, careful to balance candor with deference. Yet even the quietest observation carried political undertones. You noted the gestures, the phrasing, and the subtle cues embedded in dialogue, aware that informal discussions often revealed as much as formal counsels. Every word required measured attention, a quiet mental exercise that paralleled the physical nourishment before you. As the meal progressed, the combination of food and dialogue created a rhythm both grounding and instructive. Dates and olives offered sweetness and salt. Bread provided structure, and the meats lent weight, mirroring the intellectual and administrative substance of the conversations. Each element, edible or verbal, was woven into a larger pattern of awareness and authority. Even as the meal concluded, the calm did not dissolve. Instead, it transitioned seamlessly into the next stage of the day's devotion. Attendants cleared the platters, folding napkins and gathering empty bowls with quiet efficiency. You rose, brushing crumbs from robes that carried the weight of office, mindful of posture and demeanor. Advisors exchanged brief glances, acknowledging the shift from informal discussion to ritual observance. The midday prayer awaited, a moment to recalibrate, reaffirm purpose, and restore clarity before the afternoon's responsibilities resumed in earnest. Stepping from the dining chamber, You carried the warmth of sustenance and conversation into the quiet corridors leading to the prayer hall. The scents of herbs and roasted meats lingered faintly, mingling with the subtle echoes of the scholars' discussion. The palace, ever watchful, yet rhythmically serene, guided you toward reflection, devotion, and renewed presence. Even in this transition, the duality of duty and personal awareness remained. A caliph, both nourished and vigilant, poised between the comforts of the meal and the discipline of prayer, ready to continue the unbroken flow of governance and ceremonial responsibility. Midday prayer, under the high sun. The cool shade of the dining chamber gave way to the courtyard, now bathed in the high sun of midday. The warmth pressed against robes layered for authority, but the air carried the faint fragrance of flowering trees and the trickle of nearby fountains, offering a subtle respite. Servants and guards moved with practiced deference, guiding you toward the open space where prayer awaited, a pause in the relentless rhythm of governance. The courtyard was alive with light, the marble reflecting brilliance upward, blinding in its clarity, yet grounding in its permanence. The heat rose gently from stone and pavement, a reminder of both the season and the passage of time. Attendants stood at the edges, discreet but watchful, ensuring both order and security. Even here, the sacred act of Salah could not exist in isolation. The eyes of the palace, the whispers of expectation, and the rhythms of duty remained close, threading through each breath. You approached the designated prayer area, feeling the weight of robes and responsibility alike. The layered fabrics, warm beneath the sun, had become a familiar extension of presence and authority. Hands rose in the opening gesture, palms facing heaven, and for a moment, the world contracted. Only breath, only water, only the silent pulse of devotion existed. The courtyard, brilliant in sunlight, seemed to recede, leaving a space both intimate and infinite. As the prayer unfolded, each bow and prostration offered a rhythm that grounded the mind while also allowing reflection. The repetition of phrases, familiar and precise, created a quiet cadence that contrasted sharply with the morning's deliberations and the meal's subtle political undertones. In these moments, there was relief. A release from scrolls, disputes, and councils. A chance to recalibrate, to feel the pulse of spirituality before the empire's demands reclaimed attention. Yet even within this sacred interval, responsibilities shadowed each breath. Thoughts of pending reports, unresolved petitions, and ongoing governance surfaced at the edges of awareness. Every motion was observed, even if subtly, by attendants and guards. Every pause, every intonation, carried the unspoken weight of expectation. The act of worship became a delicate balance between inward focus and outward presence, a reminder that the Caliph's devotion was both personal and exemplary. As you rose from the final prostration, the courtyard seemed to exhale with you. The water of the fountain glimmered in sunlight, the branches of trees swayed gently in the warm breeze, and for a fleeting moment, clarity and calm prevailed. The body was restored by movement and ritual, the mind sharpened by focus, yet the pulse of responsibility had already resumed. The pause had been temporary, precious and necessary, but it was also a bridge to the next duty. Attendants approached, their expressions composed, signaling that the interval of prayer had concluded. Scrolls were already being distributed in anticipation, and a subtle shift in the palace's rhythm indicated that new demands awaited. Envoys had arrived, their presence announced by measured footsteps and the rustle of fine robes. These emissaries were not merely formalities. They were representatives of distant courts, bringing questions, requests, and negotiations that required both ceremonial poise and strategic attention. You straightened robes and adjusted the turban, feeling the familiar weight of layered fabrics and symbolism settle across shoulders. Each gesture, though small, was part of the visual language of authority, a reinforcement of presence that accompanied the inner clarity gained from prayer. The courtyard, sunlit and expansive, became both stage and conduit for the transition, from private devotion to formal audience, from inner reflection to outward engagement. As the envoys approached the central hall, the intensity of expectation returned in full force. Courtiers, scholars, and guards observed the proceedings, each with subtle attention to protocol, posture, and phrasing. The morning's councils, petitions, and judicial work had been rigorous, yet the prayer offered both renewal and preparation. Within the quiet discipline of Salah, you carried the calm, focus, and clarity necessary to receive and respond to foreign representatives with dignity and strategic foresight. With a final glance at the shimmering fountain, sunlit courtyard, you stepped forward to greet the envoys. The transition was seamless, yet profound. Devotion and authority intertwined, reflection and responsibility converged, and the rhythm of the day continued, unbroken as the Caliph prepared to navigate diplomacy, ceremony, and governance once more. Receiving foreign envoys. The courtyard, still warm from the high sun, gradually gave way to the palace's formal reception hall. Its walls, carved with intricate arabesques and inlaid with polished marble, reflected sunlight in gentle glimmers, lending the space an aura of solemnity. Courtiers and attendants moved with quiet precision, preparing the chamber for the arrival of foreign envoys. Their presence, though ceremonial, carried gravity. Each envoy represented not only distant lands, but delicate webs of alliance, negotiation, and expectation. The ambassadors entered with measured steps, their movements choreographed by both etiquette and custom. They bore gifts, finely embroidered textiles, polished vessels of bronze and gold, exotic spices and fruits that hinted at lands far beyond the palace walls. Each offering was a statement, both material and symbolic, and required acknowledgement with equal care. One misread gesture, an incorrect phrase, or misaligned seating could unravel months of diplomacy. You received them with deliberate composure. Hands rose in greeting, robes adjusted, and turbans straightened, a ritual in itself, one that communicated authority, respect, and poise. The courtiers observed quietly, noting subtle expressions and tone, while the envoy's eyes registered every movement. Diplomacy was as much about presence as it was about conversation. Every glance, nod, and bow carried meaning as weighty as the gifts themselves. The first ambassador spoke, voice carefully modulated, presenting formal greetings and recounting the journey from distant lands. You responded with attentiveness, acknowledging their words while maintaining the equilibrium of authority. There was a delicate tension in these exchanges, to convey respect without yielding advantage, to listen without signaling weakness, to respond without revealing strategy. Even in measured silence, meaning traveled in every gesture. The second envoy followed, bearing a missive that required acknowledgement of prior agreements, subtle negotiation of trade terms, and reassurance of mutual respect. The phrasing was nuanced, laden with implication, and you weighed each word before reply. Diplomacy was a dance. One step misaligned could create tension. One gesture too eager could invite expectation. Attentiveness, awareness, and precision guided each interaction. As the envoys presented gifts, you examined them with deliberate respect. Polished vessels gleamed in sunlight. Textiles shimmered with intricate embroidery, and fruits and spices carried scents both foreign and familiar. Each item was more than its substance. It was a symbol, a token of trust, or an instrument of influence. Your responses, acknowledgement, a word of appreciation, a gesture of careful care, were equally weighted. The ritual of reception transformed the hall into a space where symbolism, decorum, and strategy intersected. Questions arose from the ambassadors, phrased with practiced subtlety, probing alliances, trade, and assurances of stability. You listened with attentiveness, offering measured replies, careful to maintain authority without discourtesy. The courtier's notes, the advisor's whispers, and the scholar's quiet murmurs provided support. Yet the final bearing, phrasing, and gesture rested with you. Each exchange reinforced the fragile balance of international relations. Perception, diplomacy, and respect converging into a delicate equilibrium. By the time the last envoy had concluded, the hall felt both lighter and heavier. Lighter in that the formal interactions had concluded. Heavier in the cumulative weight of responsibility. Each departure left a trace. The memory of gestures observed, phrases exchanged, and the subtle impression you had imparted. Even the simple act of walking the ambassadors to the doors required care, posture, timing, and gaze, all signaling authority tempered with courtesy. With the final envoy gone, attendants began clearing the chamber, and the palace shifted once more toward internal matters. The diplomatic interval had concluded, leaving the empire's external relations momentarily balanced, yet requiring continued vigilance and awareness. Ahead, it awaited the war chamber, where military matters, strategy, and readiness demanded attention. The transition was seamless, yet profound. From ceremonial diplomacy to the pressing and concrete realities of defense, logistics, and command. Adjusting robes and straightening the turban, you moved with the attendants through the palace corridors. The weight of diplomacy lingered in your posture, the clarity of ceremonial precision etched into your movements. Yet the urgency of military council pressed close. The rhythm of the day persisted, unbroken. Devotion, judgment, sustenance, diplomacy, and now the decisive strategies of war, awaiting your guidance. The war chamber briefing. The formal echoes of the diplomatic audience faded behind you as the palace corridors guided you toward the war chamber, a space both solemn and commanding. The walls, adorned with maps and military insignia, reflected the gravity of the empire's defense and the constant vigilance required of leadership. Courtiers and attendants fell silent as you entered, leaving only the generals, aides, and strategic advisors, their faces set with disciplined intensity. Here, the empire's borders, troop deployments, and contested lands were not abstractions. They were immediate, tangible, and weighted with consequence. Maps were unfurled across a long oak table, their colors bright under the midday light. Mountain ranges, river valleys, desert expanses, and city fortifications were delineated meticulously, each marking a territory, contested, defended, or to be claimed. The generals moved with precision, tracing paths with fingers, pointing to positions, and discussing potential maneuvers. The room was filled with the low hum of strategic calculation, punctuated by clipped exchanges that carried urgency without alarm. Troop movements were the first matter addressed. Cavalry divisions, infantry placements, and regional garrison rotations were detailed in concise terms, yet the implications were vast. Supply lines, vulnerability points, and coordination challenges were outlined, each requiring careful consideration. You listened intently, straining to follow the intricacies while maintaining the air of calm authority that the generals expected. Even as comprehension stretched your mental focus, your posture, gaze, and responses were observed as extensions of command. Authority here was as much about presence as understanding. A commander pointed to a contested border along a northern frontier. Seasonal rains had compromised a key route, threatening supply chains and leaving troops vulnerable. Another general recommended reinforcement, yet cautioned that diverting forces might create weakness elsewhere. Every proposal carried cascading consequences. Decisions in this chamber could ripple through the empire, influencing not only military outcomes, but also the perception of power and stability. You weighed their words carefully, aware that the deliberation itself was a display of leadership, signaling both attentiveness and decisiveness. Maps of distant lands revealed ongoing skirmishes, trade route vulnerabilities, and potential alliances or threats. Generals spoke with a mixture of technical vocabulary and practical intuition, describing troop readiness, logistical limits, and morale. Your mind worked to parse each detail while maintaining the demeanor of command, attentive, composed, and authoritative. Even as complexity threatened to overwhelm, the outward poise had to remain unbroken, for both perception and practical leadership were inseparable. Supply lines were next. Discussions of grain shipments, water reserves, and equipment transport revealed the vast machinery behind military operations. A minor disruption in one province could escalate to logistical bottlenecks hundreds of miles away. The general's language was precise, their recommendations pointed and unwavering, and you responded with measured questions, clarifying positions without revealing uncertainty. The balance between inquiry and authority was delicate. Too little, and mistakes might go unnoticed. Too much, and confidence could appear lacking. Throughout the briefing, the air grew dense, thick with responsibility. The weight of defending an empire stretched across mountains, rivers, and deserts, pressed upon your shoulders with palpable intensity. Even as diagrams and verbal reports conveyed clarity, the human and material stakes made every decision heavier The mental rigor demanded was exhausting. The need to appear resolute and knowledgeable compounded the burden. Yet within this intensity lay clarity. The empire's stability, security, and future depended on attentive leadership, informed judgment, and the careful calibration of strategy. By the time the general's briefing concluded, decisions had been clarified, orders prepared, and contingencies considered. The maps were carefully rolled and stored, the room returning to its hushed, watchful stillness. Attendants guided you from the war chamber, and the weight of military responsibility remained, not as a burden, but as a presence to be carried into the next obligations of governance. The transition was subtle yet significant. From contested borders and troop movements, you now turn toward internal matters, petitions, provincial governance, and civil administration awaited, demanding the same careful balance of attention, authority, and poise. Each corridor leading away from the war chamber carried the echo of strategy and command, preparing you to move seamlessly from the realm of defense to the equally complex domain of civil oversight. With robes adjusted and turbans straightened, you stepped through the palace corridors. The mental intensity of military deliberation gradually giving way to reflection on the empire's domestic needs. The day pressed on, unbroken, each interval, from devotion to judgment, diplomacy to strategy, flowing into the next, demanding vigilance, clarity, and the continual presence of the Caliph, the pulse of the capital, leaving the calculated confines of the war chamber behind. Attendants guided you through the palace corridors and toward the gates of Damascus. The midday sun was warm against your robes, and the city beyond awaited, vibrant and alive, each street a rhythm in the living pulse of the capital. Guards flanked your passage, not merely for protection, but to ensure that your presence was both visible and deliberate, a reminder to citizens and courtiers alike of authority and continuity. As you stepped into the main thoroughfares, the city responded with subtle choreography. Merchants paused mid-task, their hands lingering over wares, eyes lifted in recognition. Citizens bowed or inclined their heads, gestures of respect mingling with curiosity. Children, momentarily drawn from play, watched wide-eyed, their innocence juxtaposed with the weight of the office you carried. Even amidst the familiar urban bustle, the surreal sense of responsibility pressed gently yet persistently upon you. Each glance from a passerby, each quiet murmur, was a reminder that authority was both embodied and observed. The streets themselves were alive. Carts rolled over cobblestones, merchants hawked spices, fruits, and textiles, and the mingled scents of bread, roasted meats, and the faint tang of the river filled the air. Damascus thrummed with life and commerce, its vibrancy unrelenting yet governed by custom, rhythm, and unspoken order. As you walked, you sensed both the beauty and unpredictability of city life. A single incident could escalate unnoticed, yet the broader patterns of labor, devotion, and trade maintained a fragile equilibrium. Your guards moved with precision, forming a subtle protective barrier while maintaining visibility, ensuring that the populace witnessed authority without fear or coercion. Their presence reinforced the duality of your role: safety and control, respect and accessibility. Even as you navigated streets filled with ordinary life, Every gesture, every step, communicated leadership. The weight of responsibility was palpable, amplified by the city's eyes and the knowledge that each interaction, however fleeting, was observed and remembered. Alongside the sensory immersion of bustling streets, your thoughts trace the demands of governance. Reports from provinces, petitions, diplomacy, and military strategy lingered in the mind, threading through the city's vitality. You reflected on the complexity of maintaining order, justice, and responsiveness across a realm as varied and expansive as your empire. The physical presence in Damascus offered clarity. Authority was enacted not only through law, counsel, and ritual, but through visibility, presence, and the subtle reassurance of a steady, deliberate gaze. A small crowd had gathered near the central market square, bowing in recognition as you passed. You inclined your head in acknowledgement, mindful of posture and gesture, conveying both respect and the assurance of stability. The surreal nature of these encounters, the simultaneous intimacy and observation, reinforced the day's unfolding rhythm. Authority was not abstract. It was lived and witnessed, tangible in every glance, gesture, and wordless acknowledgement. After several blocks of the tour, the streets gradually narrowed, guiding you toward the quieter, more contemplative spaces of the city where scholars awaited your arrival. Courtyards and arcades opened before you, calm and ordered, in contrast to the vibrant unpredictability of the main thoroughfares. Here, knowledge and discourse replaced the bustle of commerce and daily labor. The scholar's anticipation was quiet but potent, a different form of expectation than that of citizens or generals. Intellectual engagement, debate, and the guidance of learning now required attention, composure, and careful listening. As the guards positioned themselves discreetly along the edges of the arcades, you entered the courtyard where the gathering awaited. Scrolls, manuscripts, and ink-laden tables signaled preparation for discussion, reflection, and scholarly exchange. The transition was subtle yet profound. From the pulse of the capital's streets, alive with commerce and observation, to the measured calm of intellectual deliberation. Both demanded attentiveness and presence, yet each exercised a different facet of leadership, one public, immediate, and performative, the other reflective, consultative, and precise. With a final glance over the bustling streets now behind you, you allowed the city's rhythm to linger in your awareness. The scholars before you awaited guidance, insight, and engagement, and the day's flow continued seamlessly, moving from the vibrant energy of Damascus to the reflective intensity of learning, debate, and the shaping of thought within the empire's heart. Scholars and theologians gather. The quiet courtyard, scented faintly with jasmine and shaded by slender columns, welcomed you from the bustling streets of Damascus. Here, the rhythm of the city softened into a measured cadence, and the scholars and theologians assembled with anticipatory restraint. Scrolls, manuscripts, and ink-stained tables created a deliberate order, signaling both preparation and expectation. The transition from public streets to this intellectual enclave was seamless yet profound. One realm demanded presence and authority. The other demanded attentiveness and discernment. Seated on cushions arranged with meticulous care, the scholars and theologians looked to you with eyes sharpened by study and subtle anticipation. The discussion opened with legal theory. Questions of interpretation, precedent, and moral principle filled the air. Arguments were precise, layered with reference and nuance, and required your careful attention. Even silent listening demanded effort. Each nod, gesture, or subtle shift of gaze carried meaning, and your posture reflected both engagement and authority. Authority here was less ceremonial than cognitive, less visual than intellectual, yet it carried weight no less potent. A jurist posed a question regarding recent provincial rulings and their alignment with established legal precedent. Another scholar offered an interpretation of theological implications, bridging law and moral philosophy. The conversation unfolded like a tightly woven tapestry, every thread connected to others, every point contingent on understanding and discernment. Your role was complex: to listen, to weigh the arguments, and to demonstrate wisdom beyond mere observation, even when the subject stretched the boundaries of personal familiarity. Philosophical debates followed, abstract yet grounded in the practical realities of governance and societal expectation. Questions of justice, the nature of obligation, and the moral responsibilities of rulers interlaced with scriptural exegesis and historical example. The intensity of thought required a kind of vigilance different from that of the palace council or war chamber. It was subtle, internal, and cerebral, demanding sustained focus, even as ideas flowed rapidly and intricately. Occasionally, a silence would descend, pregnant with expectation. In these pauses, you sensed the scholar's appraisal of your understanding, your patience, and your capacity for synthesis. Each moment required equilibrium, the calm authority of presence, the attentiveness of intellect, and the humility to recognize limits without undermining perception. Even passive observation was active. Even reflection required discernible engagement. Gradually, the discussion began to shift toward broader matters of culture. The scholars' references extended from legal and theological texts to historical anecdotes, literary works, and poetry that reflected moral and ethical principles. The intellectual rigor remained, but the tone softened, carrying a subtle invitation to explore beauty, creativity, and cultural memory alongside abstract reasoning. Stories of poets and philosophers were recounted, their language illustrative and evocative, drawing the mind outward from doctrine toward imagination. A theologian cited verses of poetry that intertwined ethical guidance with aesthetic delight, prompting discussion about cultural responsibility, education, and the role of art in shaping public virtue. Philosophers drew parallels between legal reasoning and literary expression, demonstrating the interconnectivity of thought, morality, and cultural production. The conversation became a living demonstration of how law, theology, and literature converged within the life of an empire, each informing the other, and each demanding attentiveness, judgment, and discernment. Your responses, measured yet thoughtful, reflected both the weight of office and the openness to insight. A subtle gesture of acknowledgement, a carefully chosen phrase, or a reflective pause conveyed engagement, curiosity, and authority. Even as the discussion grew more fluid, the underlying expectation persisted: to model wisdom, to discern nuance, and to validate the scholar's dedication while contributing guidance appropriate to your station. Time passed, with the rhythm of attentive dialogue, punctuated by thoughtful gestures, the occasional recitation of verse, and the subtle exchange of manuscripts. The courtyard, bathed in late afternoon light, seemed to embrace both the intensity of intellect and the gentleness of culture. As the scholars' focus shifted toward poetry, literary style, and broader cultural reflection, you sensed a transition from rigorous debate to the contemplative enjoyment of expression, a reminder that leadership encompassed not only law and governance, but also the cultivation of taste, appreciation, and intellectual breadth. When the gathering concluded, attendants gently reminded you of the passage of time and the next obligations awaiting within the palace. The scholars, gathered with dignity and respect, offered nods of acknowledgement and quiet farewells. You rose, carrying the resonance of ideas, the weight of insight, and the awareness that authority extended beyond action into understanding. The day's rhythm continued, flowing naturally from intellectual engagement toward the more personal and ceremonial intervals that awaited. Poetry in the Caliph's court, the courtyard, still warmed by the late afternoon sun, gradually transformed as the palace attendants prepared the space for the next audience. Cushions were arranged in semicircles. Low tables, adorned with ink-stained scrolls, were replaced by trays of delicate refreshments, and the subtle scent of incense mingled with the lingering aroma of jasmine. Scholars departed quietly, leaving the chamber ready for poets whose verses would celebrate empire, devotion, and beauty. The transition from intellectual discourse to courtly arts was seamless, yet it carried its own form of pressure. Even aesthetic enjoyment demanded presence, attention, and discernment. The first poet stepped forward, robes flowing with careful elegance, eyes lowered yet mindful of your gaze. The voice, smooth and resonant, unfolded a tapestry of words extolling the grandeur of the empire, the virtue of its leaders, and the divine inspiration guiding its course. Metaphors of rivers, mountains, and the celestial sphere intertwined with praise, creating a cadence both mesmerizing and deliberate. Every syllable was chosen to impress, to elevate, and to reflect the Caliph's status not merely as ruler, but as cultural arbiter. You listened, attentive but aware of the fatigue pressing at the edges of your mind. The morning's councils, petitions, judicial sessions, diplomatic audiences, and military briefings had left mental imprints, and though the verses were beautiful, the ability to absorb them fully eluded you. Still, your demeanor remained composed. Attentive posture, measured nods, and the subtle acknowledgement of artistry conveyed appreciation without betraying exhaustion. In the Caliph's court, even aesthetic engagement was both duty and display, a performance of discernment and grace. A second poet followed, reciting lines that entwined love, nature, and moral reflection. Imagery of flowering gardens, moonlit nights, and gentle breezes transported the mind outward, yet the demands of leadership lingered like a shadow across perception. Each verse carried multiple layers: artistic skill, philosophical reflection, and the implicit expectation that the Caliph would recognize, validate, and elevate the work without overt distraction. Poetry was not mere entertainment. It was a subtle instrument of hierarchy, a reflection of cultivated taste, and a demonstration of refinement in the exercise of authority. As the recitations continued, You noted the rhythm and structure of the compositions, meter, rhyme, and cadence crafted to please both ear and intellect. The content ranged from historical praise to meditations on divine order, from allegorical tales to reflections on human experience. Though the mind's fatigue made full appreciation difficult, your presence alone validated the art. The poet's performance, measured and intentional, mirrored the expectations placed upon you to embody attentiveness, composure, and the capacity for judgment in every domain, from governance to aesthetic discernment. Subtle gestures punctuated the proceedings. Courtiers whispered quietly among themselves. Observers noted your expressions, and attendants adjusted seating and lighting to enhance both visibility and comfort. Even silence was deliberate, a means of emphasizing attention and reinforcing authority. The poets, attuned to every nuance of audience reaction, modulated tone and pacing accordingly, creating an intricate interplay between performer and ruler. You were both witness and arbiter, participant and symbol, a living presence woven into the very fabric of the art. By the time the final poet concluded, the chamber carried the lingering resonance of words and images. Applause was muted yet deliberate. The acknowledgement of skill and effort was part of the ritual, part of the courtly decorum that reinforced hierarchy and taste. Though drained, you allowed a brief moment of internal reflection, sensing the breadth of expectation that extended even into the realm of culture. The Caliph's authority encompassed not only law and governance, but also the subtle calibration of aesthetic and moral judgment. As the poets departed, musicians arrived, instruments in hand, their presence signaling a shift from verbal to auditory art. Strings, flutes, and percussion were tuned carefully, each note intended to complement the atmosphere, to soothe or inspire, and to demonstrate the palace's cultivated sophistication. The transition from poetry to music was seamless, yet it carried the same implicit expectation. Attentiveness, composure, and graceful presence remained as essential as in councils, courts, or public appearances. You straightened robes and adjusted the turban, aware that even moments of sensory engagement were intertwined with responsibility. The chamber, scented, illuminated, and alive with sound, became a space where aesthetic experience and political symbolism converged. Each performance, each recitation, and each note carried layered meaning, and your measured attention was the acknowledgement of both artistry and authority. The musicians began to play, their melodies rising gently in the late light, and you allowed a moment to absorb the harmony. Even in fatigue, even amidst relentless expectation, the court's rhythm continued. Poetry, music, and culture flowing seamlessly alongside governance, devotion, and ceremonial observance. The day's unbroken cadence pressed onward, each interval shaping both perception and performance. The Caliph's presence, a constant fulcrum balancing duty, refinement, and enduring responsibility. Music in the marble hall. The poet's verses faded into memory as attendants guided you toward the marble hall, its high ceilings arched with intricate carvings that caught the waning sunlight. The space, polished to reflect both light and presence, had been prepared for music, an art form both relaxing and laden with ceremonial significance. Cushions lined the hall for seating, and the subtle scent of incense mingled with the lingering warmth of the day. The transition from poetry to music was seamless, yet it required the same awareness and poise. Even enjoyment here was both an obligation and a reflection of cultivated taste. Musicians took their places, strings tuned with meticulous care, drums positioned to resonate evenly through the hall, and flutes arranged to allow for delicate harmonies. Their movements were deliberate, rehearsed, yet seemingly effortless, each gesture a demonstration of skill and artistry. As the first notes filled the space, the sound wrapped around you, calming yet alerting, a reminder that even pleasure within the palace was intertwined with perception and expectation. Every listener, from courtiers to attendants, maintained decorum, and you, as the Caliph, remained the fulcrum around which attention and engagement revolved. The music's rhythm was steady, the strings weaving melodies that rose and fell, like the gentle undulation of desert sands. Drums punctuated the cadence, grounding the sound in resonance that seemed to echo both the palace's architecture and the weight of office. Even as the melodies softened the mind and eased tension, the ceremonial undertones were unmistakable. Attention, presence, and discernment were required, reminding you that the Caliph's enjoyment was inseparable from performance, whether intellectual, administrative, or aesthetic. The repertoire moved fluidly from compositions celebrating historical victories to more meditative pieces inspired by nature, love, and devotion. The musician's skill was evident not only in technical mastery, but in expressive nuance. A flourish here, a pause there, each note deliberate, yet flowing with natural elegance. The hall, polished and bright, became a living instrument, resonating with both sound and the authority that your presence imparted. Even as the music soothed the spirit, the awareness of duty lingered. Courtiers exchanged quiet glances, attendants observed subtly, and your own mind navigated the delicate balance between immersion and composure. Each rising chord, each subtle tremolo, carried not only aesthetic pleasure, but also affirmation of the empire's cultural richness. A richness inseparable from the stability, order, and patronage you sustained. Music, like poetry, law, or diplomacy, was a mirror of authority, and your attentive presence confirmed its significance. As the performance progressed, the day's light softened, shifting through latticed windows and painting golden patterns on the marble floor. Shadows lengthened across cushions and columns, signaling that evening was approaching. The subtle transition in light mirrored the subtle transition of purpose, enjoyment and reflection now blending with anticipation of ritual and devotion. Even amidst the sensory immersion of music, the palace's rhythms remained intact, guiding thought and presence toward the next stage of the day. The melodies grew more contemplative, inviting introspection even as they entertained, notes intertwined with the lingering aromas of incense and the distant murmur of courtyard fountains, creating a layered atmosphere that was both serene and charged with subtle ceremony. Attention, composure, and discernment were exercised continuously. The Caliph's engagement was never purely private, never entirely unobserved. Yet within this tension, there was clarity, a reminder that the empire's cultural expression and its governance were entwined, each sustaining the other. As the final notes of the performance faded into the marble hall's acoustics, The musicians bowed, and attendants moved to signal the conclusion. The hall was quiet now, but the resonance remained, not only in the acoustics, but in the awareness it had fostered. Authority measured through taste, refinement, and attentive presence. You rose from the cushions, adjusting robes and Turistan turban with deliberate care, carrying both the calm of music and the weight of continuing duty. Evening now filled the palace, the sun low on the horizon, casting long shadows through arched windows. Attendants gestured toward the courtyard, where the ritual of sunset prayer awaited. The transition from aesthetic immersion to spiritual observance was subtle yet deliberate. From the harmonies of music to the cadence of devotion, from cultural engagement to the discipline of ritual. Each movement, each interval was both personal and performative, a reflection of the unbroken flow of a caliph's day. Stepping from the marble hall into the softer light of dusk, you allowed the lingering harmonies to accompany your measured steps. The palace shifted around you, shadows lengthened, incense floated, and the courtyard awaited, prepared for the sacred rhythm of the sunset prayer. A bridge between the day's public duties and the intimate devotion that framed your authority. Sunset prayer at day's edge, the golden light of evening spilled across the palace courtyard, painting the marble floors and fountains in warm hues of orange and amber. The long shadows of columns stretched toward the west, and the air carried the faint coolness of approaching night. The courtyard, so often the stage of public observation and ceremonial passage, now became a space of quiet reflection, the perfect threshold for the sunset prayer. Every detail, the alignment of prayer mats, the gentle ripple of water, the subtle scent of incense, was arranged with careful precision, as if the palace itself participated in the ritual. You moved deliberately to the prayer area, robes heavy yet familiar, the layered fabrics symbolizing both office and responsibility. The day's intensity pressed upon every muscle. Councils, judgments, diplomacy, military strategy, and courtly expectation had accumulated, leaving the body fatigued, though the mind remained alert and the heart attuned to devotion. Even in weariness, the physical motions of Salah were grounding. The rising, bowing, and prostration became a cadence that anchored thought and spirit, restoring clarity amid the relentless demands of authority. The first words of the prayer rose with measured intention. Your voice, steady yet softened by exhaustion, resonated across the courtyard. Each verse was both a ritual and a meditation, the sound mingling with the distant rustle of leaves and the faint trickle of the fountain. Muscles tired from the day's ceremonial postures felt a subtle release in each bow, each prostration, each rise, as the body and spirit aligned in practiced harmony. The courtyard itself seemed to absorb the devotion, the sun's fading warmth accompanying the inward rhythm of reflection. Even as focus deepened, the awareness of responsibility remained. Every gesture, every pause, every breath was observed by attendants, quietly ensuring correctness, order, and respect. Yet in this shared stillness, the weight of office became almost tangible. The empire's needs, the council of scholars, the pleas of citizens, and the vigilance of generals lingered in thought, threading through the ritual like a faint echo. Physical fatigue contended with spiritual grounding, reminding you that leadership was as much endurance as it was discernment. The prayers moved toward completion, each motion deliberate, each intention measured. In the final prostration, there was a moment of profound stillness, a pause in which the day's demands and the palace's rhythm converged. Time seemed to stretch, the courtyard quiet except for subtle sounds, the flutter of a leaf, the ripple of water, the faint murmurs of attendants ensuring decorum. In that suspended instant, exhaustion met clarity. The long hours of duty, the constant observation, and the mental rigor of rulings, councils, and engagements coalesced into a single, quiet affirmation of purpose. Rising slowly, you completed the concluding recitations, hands lifted briefly in silent acknowledgement before folding them over the chest. The courtyard, now suffused with the deepening orange and violet of sunset, reflected both serenity and the enduring weight of expectation. Attendants stepped forward, bowing respectfully, signaling that the ritual had concluded and that the next interval of the day awaited. Even as you straightened robes and adjusted the turban, the transition from ritual devotion to familial engagement began. Courtiers and attendants moved quietly to prepare for your passage toward private chambers, signaling that a family gathering had been arranged. The shift, though gentle, carried its own expectations, presence, attentiveness, and the nuanced performance of personal authority within intimate spaces. Even in private, the Caliph's comportment remained deliberate, balancing personal connection with the subtle projection of dignity and reassurance. The courtyard's glow faded gradually, replaced by the soft illumination of lamps placed along corridors and arcades. The palace, ever attentive to rhythm and ceremony, guided you along the familiar passages, moving from public devotion to private engagement. The footsteps of attendants and the rustle of robes accompanied measured steps, reminding you that each interval, however intimate, was framed within the larger continuity of presence and responsibility. By the time the chambers opened to receive you, the sun had dipped below the horizon, leaving only traces of light and the quiet hum of palace life. Even as the mind carried the day's accumulated burdens, the ritual of prayer had provided a temporary anchor, a moment of spiritual clarity and reflection amid the relentless cadence of leadership. Ahead awaited family, a different kind of audience, one that would demand a gentleness and attentiveness distinct from councils, courts, or ceremonies. The day's flow continued unbroken, a delicate rhythm of devotion, duty, and human connection within the family quarters. Leaving the courtyard behind, the attendants guided you through the palace corridors toward the private family quarters. The sounds of the day, footsteps, council discussions, petitions, and distant music softened gradually, replaced by quieter echoes and the gentle scent of flowering indoor gardens. Lamps illuminated the hallways with warm, flickering light, casting patterns on the stone floors that mirrored the fading hues of sunset outside. Here, the rhythm shifted from public performance and ceremonial expectation to the measured intimacy of family life. yet the weight of authority persisted subtly in every step. As you entered the family chambers, familiar voices greeted you, carrying warmth, expectation, and subtle forms of deference. Children ran forward, their energy momentarily unchecked, but tempered by habit and the quiet guidance of attendants. Wives and relatives offered bows, kisses upon the cheek, and careful smiles, gestures both affectionate and mindful of your station. Domestic life was gentler in appearance, but it was structured, orchestrated in its own way. Every greeting, every exchange, carried layered meaning, balancing familiarity with respect. You moved among them with measured attentiveness, responding to names and inquiries, adjusting robes, and lowering your gaze briefly to meet the eyes of the youngest. Conversations were gentle yet purposeful, ranging from playful remarks to questions about the day, school, or household matters. Even within this intimate circle, your presence shaped behavior. Children straightened, attendants adjusted positions, and conversations flowed with careful rhythm. The palace's hierarchy, though softened by family bonds, remained perceptible. Authority persisted alongside affection. The family's warmth provided a momentary reprieve, a space to feel the human connection that public duty often obscured. Yet even as laughter and tender words filled the chamber, awareness lingered. Matters of governance, diplomacy, and ritual still awaited. Attentiveness was not suspended, only reframed. The gestures of care, the laughter of children, and the quiet counsel of spouses became part of a broader tapestry in which personal and official identity intertwined. Children brought forward small drawings or recited memorized verses, offering tokens of accomplishment and affection. Each presentation was met with encouragement, acknowledgement, and gentle correction where appropriate. Wives shared observations of the household, minor issues that might otherwise seem trivial, yet each comment was noted. An attentive caliph listened not merely to engage, but to integrate information into the continuous awareness of palace and domestic life. Every smile, nod, and word reinforced presence, subtly shaping the environment without diminishing intimacy. Evening meals, shared quietly within the chambers, reflected this balance. Simple yet carefully arranged fare, eaten with attentiveness, conversation flowing easily but never unstructured. Courtiers or attendants remained nearby, unobtrusive but ready, a reminder that even in domesticity, the caliph's well-being and comportment were part of the palace's careful orchestration. The domestic sphere, though warm and intimate, carried its own rhythm of expectation. The conversation naturally shifted toward stories, education, and reflections on the day. Children's anecdotes blended with gentle guidance, while relatives offered insights into household matters or minor administrative concerns. The discussion was not merely recreational, it was subtly instructive, reinforcing values, expectations, and continuity. Your responses, balanced between authority and affection, modeled behavior, conveyed attentiveness, and sustained the subtle structures of influence that extended from the palace chambers to the broader empire. As the family interval concluded, attendants approached with quiet signals. Evening consultations awaited. The transition was gentle, yet unmistakable. From the warmth and intimacy of domestic life, you were reminded once more of the persistent demands of governance. Even here, the Caliph's presence had been a stabilizing force, a measure of authority intertwined with personal connection. Standing to depart, you allowed brief gestures of farewell, bows, kisses, nods, acknowledging both affection and duty. Walking down the softly lit corridors, you carried the residual calm of family life alongside the awareness of forthcoming deliberations. The palace, in its unbroken rhythm, guided you from private warmth to the structured intensity of evening councils, ensuring that each interval, domestic, ceremonial, or administrative, flowed seamlessly into the next. Even as night deepened, the day's cadence persisted, devotion, governance, culture, and family intertwined, each requiring attention, poise, and enduring presence. Evening consultations with trusted advisors. The warmth of family quarters faded behind you as attendants guided you through dimly lit corridors toward the council room, reserved for evening consultations. Lamps glowed with soft amber light, casting long shadows across polished stone floors and arched walls. The palace, now quieter, seemed to hold its breath, a subtle signal that the day's public spectacle had ended and the intimate work of private council was about to begin. The transition from domesticity to these confidential gatherings was seamless yet profound. The pressures were different, quieter, yet heavier in their intensity. The room was smaller than the morning's diwan, yet suffused with gravity. Only a handful of trusted advisors awaited, their presence deliberate and carefully curated. Scholars, military commanders, and diplomats leaned forward, aware that each word would be weighed not merely for content, but for the subtle nuances of trust, loyalty, and implication. The intimacy of the setting intensified the sense of responsibility. Here, nothing could be masked by ceremony. Truth, counsel, and vigilance prevailed in their raw form. The topics began cautiously, yet the delicate threshold of trust was quickly crossed. Private concerns about provincial governance, rumors of unrest, and whispers of shifting alliances emerged, delivered with measured tone but unflinching candor. You listened, noting posture, hesitation, and choice of words, aware that even a minor misinterpretation could affect decisions with far-reaching consequences. Every report, every observation carried weight. Every pause, every subtle glance demanded careful attention. Threats were discussed openly, plots, discontent among commanders, and potential rivalries at the edges of influence. The room felt tense yet controlled, a space where honesty was both demanded and risky. As each advisor spoke, you weighed not only the content of their words, but the intention behind them, calibrating both response and judgment. Power, you realized, was fragile here, held not in physical control alone, but in perception, loyalty, and the careful orchestration of information. Even minor shifts in tone or trust could ripple across the empire, altering alliances and affecting the stability painstakingly maintained throughout the day. Alliances were another focus. Diplomatic nuances, marriage arrangements, provincial loyalties, and military dependencies were discussed in layered detail. Each scenario was examined from multiple angles, contingency after contingency considered. You absorbed the intricacies as best you could, even as exhaustion crept into muscles and mind alike. The day's cumulative fatigue weighed on your attention, yet outward composure remained essential. The advisors relied on your discernment, your calm authority, and your ability to weigh conflicting counsel without revealing uncertainty. The conversation often circled back to subtle ethical questions: how to balance justice with mercy, how to respond to provocations without inviting instability, how to enforce law without alienating subjects or subordinates. Each decision, each consideration, demanded both intellect and intuition, a constant negotiation between principle and pragmatism. The intimacy of the room amplified the stakes. Here, counsel was private, yet consequences were public and irreversible. Despite mental exertion, you allowed moments for reflection between points of discussion, absorbing reports, recalling prior knowledge, and framing strategic responses. Advisors, observing your pauses, waited patiently, recognizing that deliberation itself was an exercise of authority. Even in silence, the presence of leadership conveyed more than words ever could. Assurance, attentiveness, and the steadying hand of experience, however fatigued. Hours passed with measured intensity, each segment of discussion reinforcing the delicate balance between vigilance and trust. By the time the consultations concluded, decisions had been made, instructions clarified, and sensitive matters addressed with discretion and foresight. The room exhaled its tension, a subtle relief echoing in the walls and lamps, leaving only the quiet reminder of the empire's fragility and the caliph's enduring responsibility. Exhaustion pressed heavily upon your body now, a cumulative weight of counsels, deliberations, diplomacy, and ceremonial presence. Attendants appeared once more, signaling the next interval. The night meal, modest yet necessary, a final pause before the palace and city settled fully into darkness. The transition was gentle, yet palpable, from the concentrated intensity of confidential counsel to the restorative simplicity of sustenance. Even as you moved toward the dining chamber, the awareness of vigilance, loyalty, and fragile authority lingered, carried silently beneath each step. Walking through dimly lit corridors toward the meal, robes brushing quietly against stone floors, you carried both the mental imprint of sensitive discussions and the quiet anticipation of nourishment. The palace's rhythm, unbroken since the morning, persisted into the night. Devotion, governance, diplomacy, cultural engagement, family, and counsel flowed seamlessly, each interval marked by attention, presence, and the ever-present weight of authority. The Caliph's evening meal. The corridors leading from the evening consultations opened onto a more intimate chamber prepared for the night meal. Lamps glowed softly along the walls, their golden light reflecting off polished tiles and gilded surfaces. Tables were set with meticulous precision. Platters of roasted meats, seasoned grains, fresh fruits, dates, and flatbreads arranged not only for sustenance but for aesthetic balance. Every detail, from the placement of utensils to the flow of attendants, reinforced the subtle choreography of authority, civility, and decorum. The transition from the intensity of counsel to the ritualized calm of dining was subtle yet exacting, a continuation of the day's unbroken cadence. You were seated at the head of the table, the weight of the day pressing gently into shoulders and limbs. The meal, elaborate yet tightly controlled, demanded attention to both nourishment and ceremony. Each gesture, lifting a utensil, sipping water, adjusting robes, was observed, recorded silently, and often interpreted by advisors, attendants, and courtiers alike. Even in sustenance, presence was performative. Even in private repose, the expectations of authority persisted. Conversations flowed between courses, advisors offering quiet commentary on matters both administrative and ceremonial. Their words were measured, their tone respectful yet probing, extending the day's counsel into the intimacy of the evening. Questions about provincial governance, trade disputes, or military readiness were raised casually, interwoven with commentary on culture, literature, and poetry. Even at the table, the caliph's mind could not fully disengage. Attentiveness remained a constant requirement, and the subtle performance of composure never slackened. The food, while rich and carefully prepared, became almost secondary to the ritual of dining. Each bite was deliberate, each sip of water calculated to maintain decorum. You felt the cumulative weight of the day settle deeper into bones and joints, the muscles fatigued from hours of upright posture, ceremonial gestures, and constant vigilance. Yet the palace demanded continuity. Presence, poise, and engagement carried through every sensory experience, from counsel to cuisine. Advisors occasionally paused to allow moments of reflection, giving the meal an almost meditative cadence. Between courses, you observed the subtle gestures of attendants adjusting platters, refilling water vessels, or attending to lighting. Their actions, quiet yet precise, reinforced both the ritual and the broader symbolism. Even in rest, authority required structure, attentiveness, and careful orchestration. The palace itself seemed to embody this rhythm, each shadow, flicker of lamp, and muted sound echoing the patterns of responsibility and expectation. The day's conversations, memories, and decisions circulated in your mind as you ate. Requests from citizens, reports from generals, petitions of scholars, and the subtleties of diplomacy mingled with poetic recitations and music, forming a tapestry of awareness that weighed heavily despite the simplicity of sustenance. Even moments of private reflection were framed within the context of office. The caliph's body and mind intertwined with responsibility. As courses concluded, the meal's ceremonial rhythm tapered. Plates were cleared with quiet precision, attendants arranging the chamber for repose and reflection. The lamps burned lower, the shadows lengthened, and the palace settled into the gentle cadence of nightfall. The transition from shared nourishment to solitude and rest was seamless, yet imbued with ritual. The day's responsibilities were not concluded with food, but absorbed and held in readiness for the morrow. Rising from the table, you adjusted robes and turban with deliberate care. Even the act of leaving the dining chamber was imbued with significance. Posture, pace, and expression conveyed authority, continuity, and poise. Attendants moved silently to guide you along corridors, now softened by night, ensuring that the palace's rhythm remained unbroken, its structure both protective and ceremonial. The final glimmers of daylight vanished, replaced by a gentle darkness punctuated by lamplight and the distant murmur of fountains. The palace exhaled into night, the day's relentless flow of prayer, council, culture, and governance gradually yielding to quiet reflection. In the evening's dimness, the caliph's body and mind finally felt the cumulative weight of hours of decisions made, duties performed, and presence sustained. Yet the palace remained a living organism, its rhythms poised between vigilance and repose, ready to carry authority into the next day. Walking the palace at night. The clatter and murmur of the day had faded into memory, leaving only the gentle resonance of your footsteps against polished marble floors. The corridors of the palace, once alive with voices, petitions, and the soft shuffle of attendants, now lay quiet, illuminated by the flickering glow of lamps. Shadows stretched long across arches and alcoves, painting familiar spaces in unfamiliar angles, lending both mystery and a subtle intimacy to the night. The transition from the structured engagement of evening meals to the hushed solitude of the palace was profound, yet the awareness of ever-present expectation lingered, woven invisibly through the darkness. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of incense from earlier rituals and the lingering warmth of the day's stone and wood. Each breath felt slightly sharper, more deliberate, as if the palace itself was attuning to the slowing rhythm of night. You moved carefully, robes brushing against the marble, aware that each footfall, though private, was still an extension of your authority. Even in solitude, the caliph's presence could not fully escape observation. Attentive guards, though silent and respectful, maintained their stations, a reminder that visibility and protection were inseparable. The halls were familiar, yet transformed by absence. Tapestries hung still, fountains whispered faintly from distant courtyards, and the occasional echo of a distant lamp being tended reminded you of life continuing elsewhere in the palace. The hush amplified perception. The subtle creak of a floorboard, the muted sway of a curtain, or the gentle ripple of water seemed magnified, each sound carrying the weight of attention. Solitude existed, yet it was layered with the quiet vigilance of palace life, a reminder that rest and reflection were never entirely free from the responsibilities you bore. As you walked, memories of the day flowed alongside the dim light. Morning prayers, councils, petitions, poetry, music, and intimate family moments replayed in sequence, like a living scroll of duty and engagement. Even the briefest pause in a hall seemed to hold the echoes of countless interactions, each decision, each gesture, resonating with authority and consequence. The palace was no longer merely architecture. It was a chronicle, a repository of presence, observation, and ceremonial expectation, both public and private. Guards approached at intervals, subtle yet vigilant, ensuring your path remained secure. Their presence was unobtrusive, yet unmistakable. The palace's rhythm continued even in apparent solitude, a delicate balance between privacy and surveillance. Every corridor, every arch, every shadowed niche reminded you that leadership existed in layers, visible and invisible, physical and psychological, a constant negotiation between freedom and responsibility. Passing familiar chambers, family quarters, council rooms, courtyards, you sensed the traces of life that had occupied them earlier. The echoes of conversation, laughter, counsel, and music seemed embedded in walls, floors, and fountains, a subtle record of both daily ritual and human intimacy. Each space held memory, expectation, and authority simultaneously, and your movement through them carried the weight of continuity. The Caliph's presence maintained cohesion, symbolically linking morning devotion to evening reflection, public duty to private counsel. Eventually, the path led toward your personal study, the heart of contemplation and governance. Attendance discreetly signaled its preparation. Ink, scrolls, and quiet illumination arranged with precision, awaiting thought, planning, and reflection. The guards maintained their discreet positions, ensuring safety while honoring the sanctity of the chamber. The journey through the Night Palace, though solitary in sensation, underscored a profound truth. Even in quiet, the Caliph remained the axis around which life, order, and vigilance revolved. Stepping into the study, you paused to absorb the subtle stillness, the cool air, the soft glow of lamps, and the faint murmur of distant fountains combined to create a space both secure and contemplative. Here, the day's duties and decisions could be reviewed, contemplated, and recorded. The night was not merely a respite, it was a continuation of authority in a quieter register, a chance to reflect, plan, and anticipate, all under the watchful yet unobtrusive gaze of palace order. As you settled into the study, the halls behind you silent and shadowed, the palace itself seemed to breathe. A living organism attuned to the rhythms of devotion, governance, culture, and presence. Even in the apparent solitude of night, the subtle pressure of responsibility lingered, a quiet companion accompanying reflection, planning, and the inexorable continuation of imperial duty. The burden of letters and seals, the quiet of your study settled around you like a familiar cloak. Yet even in this sanctuary of lamp-lit calm, the presence of duty pressed persistently. Tables were arranged with meticulous precision, each surface bearing stacks of letters, scrolls, and petitions, their neat order belying the weight each contained. Governors, scholars, emissaries, and petitioners had sent their words across provinces and courts, and now, late into the night, they awaited your judgment. The palace outside had quieted, yet the imperatives of governance remained immediate, unavoidable, and absolute. Inkpots glimmered in the soft lamplight, and seals of polished bronze and engraved motifs lay ready at hand. Each letter demanded careful reading, thoughtful deliberation, and, ultimately, the pressing of a seal that rendered decisions permanent. The act was deceptively simple: dip, press, lift. But each motion bore consequences that could ripple across borders, families, and entire provinces. Authority crystallized in wax and ink, tangible, yet symbolic, irreversible, yet informed by judgment exercised in solitude. You began with correspondence from distant governors, reports of harvest yields, minor border disputes, and requests for reinforcements. Each document carried the weight of expectation, the subtle pressure of deference, and the unspoken reliance on your discretion. Decisions had to be precise. Words chosen hastily or signatures given without full consideration could unravel months of careful governance. You moved methodically, reading aloud in hushed tones when clarity demanded it, pausing between paragraphs to absorb context, recall prior reports, or consult marginal notes. Petitions from citizens and scholars followed, varied in tone, urgency, and complexity. Some were appeals for justice, others for resources, recognition, or intervention in disputes too localized for military or provincial oversight. You read each with deliberate attention, noting not only the content, but the nuances of language, the subtleties of honorifics, and the weight of implied consequences. Even at night, in the absence of councils or courts, the moral and administrative responsibilities of rulership remained, pressing you to balance justice, pragmatism, and foresight. Each seal, pressed into wax, reaffirmed authority. The cold bronze against paper, the resistance of the soft wax, and the clarity of the impression provided tangible evidence of decision-making, yet each mark also carried permanence. The authority it embodied could not be withdrawn without ceremony and explanation. The Caliph's presence, discernment, and judgment were inseparable from each decision. The tactile act of sealing was itself a meditation on responsibility, a physical reminder that governance was both abstract and concrete, cerebral and embodied. The night stretched onward, hours marked only by the shifting glow of lamps and the gradual cooling of the air. Advisors had long since departed, and courtiers remained at a respectful distance, leaving you alone with ink, parchment, and the echo of authority. Decisions spanned military logistics, fiscal matters, religious guidance, and civil administration, each document a fragment of the empire's intricate machinery. The mind, despite exhaustion, remained attentive, weighing consequences, considering precedent, and balancing the needs of justice, stability, and loyalty. At last, the final letter awaited the seal, a petition from a scholar advocating for a new endowment for learning. The words were thoughtful, carefully composed, and modest in tone, a contrast to the day's more urgent or politically charged correspondence. You read it slowly, absorbing the nuance, reflecting on the scholar's dedication, and feeling the subtle satisfaction of concluding the day's official obligations. With deliberate care, the seal pressed into wax, imprinting authority, yet leaving space for hope, encouragement, and continuity. The stacks of letters were gone. The weight of the day's irrevocable decisions finally eased from the table, if not entirely from your mind. Silence settled in the study, broken only by the distant murmur of fountains and the soft rustle of robes and parchment. The night now invited rare personal reflection, a moment to consider not only the empire's needs and the mechanics of rule, but the nature of leadership itself. The burdens carried, the vigilance required, and the subtle balance between presence and introspection. Rising from the table, you allowed a slow exhalation, the culmination of a day's relentless sequence of decisions. The study, still glowing with lamplight, became a space of private thought, where the Caliph could, for a fleeting interval, contemplate the empire not as a series of documents, petitions, or seals, but as a living, breathing organism sustained through constant attention, judgment, and care. Outside, the palace had quieted fully. Inside, the weight of authority had eased just enough to glimpse the contours of personal reflection, the rare luxury at the day's edge. a moment of solitude and reflection. The study, now emptied of scrolls, letters, and attendants, offered a rare, almost fragile calm. Lamps flickered gently, casting warm light across polished floors and parchment-strewn tables. But the quiet extended beyond illumination into the very air itself. Only the soft, distant sound of palace fountains reached your ears, a slow, rhythmic murmur that seemed to mark the passage of night rather than the relentless pace of duty. Here, in this temporary sanctuary, the weight of the day's obligations settled fully upon you, tangible in shoulders, limbs, and the steady rhythm of your breath. Seated on a low divan, robes gathered carefully around you. The mind wandered through the long hours now behind. Councils, poetry, music, prayers, family gatherings, and consultations replayed in careful succession, a continuous record of presence, decision, and ceremony. The sheer scope of authority, the endless sequence of expectations, and the unceasing gaze of subjects and advisors alike pressed upon the spirit in ways the body could only partially register. For a brief, fleeting moment, the magnitude of responsibility seemed almost unbearable. The empire's borders, the loyalty of governors, the welfare of citizens, the intricacies of culture and devotion, all balanced delicately upon your judgment. Yet within this quiet, a subtle sense of relief began to emerge. The silence, so different from the controlled bustle of palace life, was almost soothing. It allowed a rare intimacy with thought itself, consideration unframed by ceremony, reflection unmeasured by scrutiny. You observed the faint glimmer of lamplight on the marble floor, the slow movement of shadows across arches, the soft shimmer of a distant fountain. For a few heartbeats, the palace felt less like a theater of authority and more like a sanctuary, a space where the self, not the office, might briefly inhabit its own rhythm. Your mind, however, did not fully untether. Even in solitude, the contours of responsibility traced themselves. Letters signed, petitions resolved, councils advised. The empire's machinery continued in invisible motion, guided by decisions made and preserved through the day. You considered the fragility of leadership, how easily a misjudgment could ripple outward, affecting lives, alliances, and stability. The quiet emphasized the contrast between this stillness and the unrelenting pace of governance, reminding you that even moments of repose were tempered by vigilance. In the hush, thoughts drifted to personal reflection, the balance of duty and human desire, the persistence of expectation, and the strange intimacy of authority that demanded both presence and careful restraint. You pondered the subtle currents of loyalty and fear, admiration and resentment that ran through the palace and provinces alike. Power, you realized, was simultaneously tangible and elusive, confirmed by letters and seals, enforced by guards and decrees, yet always fragile, maintained only through continuous attention, awareness, and deliberate action. Even as the quiet encouraged introspection, the body remained weary, every muscle heavy from a day spent in ritual, observation, and movement. The comfort of solitude was tempered by a lingering awareness. The day's work had ended, but night's final ritual remained. Attendants and guards, ever observant, ensured that devotion was uninterrupted. The presence of the night guard at the doorway served as a gentle yet persistent reminder that the day's duties extended into spiritual obligation. Even in rare reflection, the Caliph's life could not fully disentangle personal thought from ceremonial rhythm. You rose slowly, stretching stiffened limbs and adjusting robes, letting your gaze travel to the faintly glowing fountains beyond the courtyard windows. The serene sounds, the delicate flicker of lamplight, and the gentle quiet of the palace blended to create a moment of suspended time, a fleeting interlude in which the weight of empire was acknowledged, considered, and absorbed, even if never released. With measured steps, you followed the night guard's quiet signal toward the courtyard prepared for prayer. Each motion, walking through dimly lit halls, pausing at familiar arches, and inhaling the cooler night air, was deliberate, a ritualized transition from reflection to devotion. The palace's quiet seemed to fold around you, accommodating presence, reinforcing ritual, and maintaining the subtle cadence of authority even in darkness. The moment of solitude, brief and rare, lingered in memory as you approached the prayer area. A reminder that reflection, though fleeting, was necessary, grounding both mind and spirit. The night, heavy with responsibility, yet soft with silence, offered clarity. The Caliph's life balanced between the unceasing demands of rule and the rare intimacies of personal thought. Each interval shaping the next, each moment of awareness reinforcing the enduring weight of presence. The night prayer and cooling air. The courtyard had transformed under the quiet glow of the moon. Shadows softened, columns stretched long and elegant across the marble, and fountains mirrored the pale light with ripples that moved like liquid silver. The once vibrant space, alive with footsteps, petitions, and ceremonial bustle, now seemed hushed, serene, and almost otherworldly. The night air carried a delicate coolness, drifting in from the gardens and courtyards, brushing against robes and skin, offering a subtle reprieve from the day's lingering heat and exertion. You approached the prayer area slowly, each step deliberate, robes brushing softly against the polished stone. Fatigue pressed in with every motion, a cumulative weight built from countless hours of councils, audiences, ritual, and attentiveness. Yet, even in weariness, the rhythm of the day's devotion demanded completion. The night prayer awaited, a final act of reflection, submission, and spiritual alignment. The silence of the courtyard, punctuated only by the gentle trickle of fountains, lent the ritual a meditative clarity, softening both mind and body. The first movements of prayer were slow, deliberate, measured. Rising, bowing, and prostrating required effort, yet each motion grounded the spirit, offering a fragile balance between exhaustion and serenity. The moonlight highlighted the stillness of the courtyard, illuminating arches, columns, and the subtle gleam of water, transforming ordinary motions into ritual gestures that bridged physical practice and spiritual contemplation. Each breath carried the faint coolness of night, refreshing yet light, as if the palace itself encouraged a final moment of renewal before rest. Even as the prayer's cadence unfolded, the day's intensity lingered, pressing subtly against the mind. Decisions made, petitions granted, councils led, poetry and music observed, all converged in the quiet rhythm of movement and recitation. Fatigue slowed limbs, yet the mind remained attentive, balancing reverence with lingering responsibility. The courtyard, empty of voices and observers became a private theater in which authority, devotion, and introspection intertwined. Each posture a silent affirmation of continuity and presence. The repetition of words, the resonance of voice, and the measured prostrations created a slow, almost hypnotic rhythm. Time, so precise and demanding throughout the day, seemed suspended, stretching each gesture into a moment of contemplation. The cool night air pressed gently against the skin, the slight breeze carrying scents of gardens, fountains, and incense, mingling in a subtle symphony of sensation that eased muscles, softened tension, and reminded the Caliph of the fragile balance between bodily endurance and spiritual focus. As the prayer drew toward conclusion, the moonlight deepened, casting softer shadows that seemed to fold the courtyard into itself. The final gestures were executed with deliberate care. Hands lifted, palms pressed together, foreheads bowed, and breath released. In that moment of stillness, the palace appeared to exhale with you, a shared pause between stone, water, and sky. Fatigue, long deferred by duty and ritual, settled fully into the body, yet the spirit felt the quiet reinforcement of continuity, devotion, and purpose. Attendants, ever attentive yet unobtrusive, approached gently, ready to guide you toward your private chambers. Their presence was both comforting and formal. Steadying arms, quiet steps, and subtle support ensured that the transition from courtyard to chamber remained graceful, dignified, and in harmony with ritual propriety. Even in these final movements, the Caliph's presence conveyed both authority and endurance. The performance of leadership subtly continuing through posture, attention, and measured steps. The cool night air followed along corridors as you moved toward the private chambers, carrying with it the faint echoes of fountains, the whisper of wind through gardens, and the distant murmur of palace life settling into sleep. Each step, though weary, was deliberate, a reminder that even rest was framed by awareness, structure, and the subtle cadence of authority. The courtyard, now behind you, lingered in memory, its serene moonlight, calm waters, and gentle shadows a final affirmation of order, ritual, and the continuity of the empire's presence. By the time the chambers opened to receive you, the night had deepened fully, the palace quiet and still, yet alive in shadow and subtle movement. The day's unbroken sequence, from dawn prayer to night consultation, from councils to family moments, culminated here in both release and reflection. Fatigue pressed into muscles, yet the mind retained a quiet alertness, the residual awareness of responsibility, the soft resonance of ritual, and the subtle, enduring rhythm of authority. Preparing for rest in royal chambers, the corridor from the courtyard led you quietly to the threshold of your private chambers, where the soft glow of lamps reflected off polished wood and inlaid stone. The sounds of the palace had softened to a near whisper. Only distant fountains and the occasional rustle of an attentive attendant punctuated the night. Even here, in the sanctuary of your own chambers, the day's cadence lingered. Authority, ritual, and expectation had not fully loosened their hold. The transition from public presence to private repose was subtle, deliberate, yet unmistakable. A final ritual before sleep. Attendants moved with careful precision, guiding you through the necessary sequences of preparation. Layers of ceremonial robes, silk, and embroidered tunics were removed in deliberate order, folded or draped with quiet reverence. Each adjustment of fabric carried its own ceremonial weight, reminding you that even intimacy and comfort were framed by structure and attention. Underneath, simple night garments were provided, soft fabrics that promised relief yet demanded no less composure, no less dignity in their careful arrangement. The bed itself was a carefully arranged oasis of comfort, yet it retained a formal elegance befitting its occupant. Cushions and blankets were fluffed and layered with precision, embroidered fabrics smoothed, and the positioning of pillows calculated to support repose without diminishing the palace's aesthetic order. The attendants, silent and efficient, ensured that every element was in place, every fold and angle exact, a reflection of both care and the continued projection of authority. The ritual of bedtime, though gentle and intimate, echoed the structured rhythm of the entire day. Deliberate, meticulous, and imbued with purpose. You lowered yourself onto the mattress, feeling the weight of the day settle fully into your body. Muscles, stiff from hours of counsels, prayer, walking, and ceremonial presence, protested briefly before yielding to the subtle support beneath you. Even the simple act of lying down was mediated by attention. Posture, alignment, and the careful arrangement of robes and blankets all reinforced the continuity of presence, even in private. Fatigue pressed heavily, yet the mind remained attentive, unable entirely to relinquish vigilance. Attendants adjusted the final folds of bedding, brushed a hand lightly over the pillow, and ensured that the lamps cast soft, non-intrusive light. Comfort was offered, yet its subtle control reminded you that rest, like all else in the palace, was curated, structured, and observed. The private nature of the chambers allowed intimacy of thought, yet even here, the palace's rhythms and expectations remained present. A quiet but persistent undercurrent beneath the surface of repose. For a moment, you closed your eyes, allowing the day to drift through memory. Morning prayers, councils, audiences, family moments, poetry, music, letters, and consultations, all layered into a continuous tapestry of duty and presence. The mind traced these threads, acknowledging both the accomplishments and the weight carried. Fatigue pulled at limbs and shoulders, yet the spirit remained subtly alert, aware of the palace's enduring hum, the guards' quiet stations, and the unbroken continuity of governance. Even as comfort embraced you, sleep remained elusive. Thoughts lingered on the day's unresolved questions, decisions made, and the delicate balance of justice, authority, and compassion. The ceremonial layers removed from the body did not immediately release the mind from the intricate choreography of leadership. Yet the stillness of the room, the gentle illumination, and the absence of external distractions offered a rare intimacy, a space to inhabit private thought, reflection, and anticipation, however fleeting. The lamps flickered softly, shadows dancing across walls and ceiling, a silent reminder that even the quiet of night was part of the palace's rhythm. Guards remained nearby, discreet but vigilant, their presence a subtle counterpoint to the serenity of the chamber. You lay there heavily, body relieved, yet mind unquiet, feeling the cumulative intensity of a day that had demanded presence, composure, and authority without pause. Eventually, the slow cadence of breath began to deepen. Muscles relaxed further, eyelids grew heavier, and the palace's quiet rhythm settled around you like a protective embrace. The ceremonial structure of the day had yielded, for the first time, to the private ritual of rest, even if the mind had not fully followed. Within the carefully prepared chamber, you lingered between wakefulness and sleep, aware that even here, leadership, duty, and the empire's weight were present, suspended delicately in the cool night air. The sounds of the palace. After dark, the private chamber offered a fragile illusion of solitude, yet the palace was never truly silent. Even in darkness, the hum of activity persisted, a quiet symphony of vigilance, routine, and latent expectation. From behind closed doors came distant footsteps, guards pacing corridors, their boots muted against polished stone, each step measured and deliberate. Occasionally, a faint murmur of conversation drifted from nearby chambers, voices hushed, yet alive with content, debate, or inquiry. The night, though visually calm, thrummed with life, a reminder that the Caliph's presence extended beyond physical proximity into the very fabric of palace routine. Even lying on your bed, fatigue heavy upon shoulders and limbs, the mind remained alert. Years of training and experience had ingrained the understanding that a ruler never fully escapes observation, and that even sleep could carry political implication. The palace's architecture, designed to facilitate both safety and visibility, amplified this awareness. The faint creak of a floorboard, the shuffle of a servant adjusting a lamp, or the distant clink of metal from a guard's armor could all indicate something benign, or the first trace of threat. The night was not merely a pause. It was a continued extension of duty, vigilance threaded through quiet. From the corridor outside, a faint breeze carried the scent of incense and night-blooming flowers, yet it also bore whispers, a guard's voice, soft, almost hesitant. "Sire, there are murmurs of unrest beyond the eastern gate." The words were careful, respectful, yet threaded with urgency. Even in the intimate safety of chambers, the empire pressed in through these subtle channels. The statement did not demand immediate action, but it reminded you that authority, like night itself, could never fully recede. Every sound, every movement, every whisper held potential meaning, and your presence, whether awake or resting, sustained the balance of power. The room felt alive with these layered rhythms, the soft ripple of fountains from distant courtyards, the occasional adjustment of curtains or bedding by attendants, the distant echo of guards exchanging brief reports, and the whisper of wind threading through open windows. Each element was ordinary in isolation, yet together they created a tapestry of vigilance, a constant awareness that authority never sleeps entirely. You listened with a blend of attentiveness and fatigue, absorbing detail while attempting to release tension, seeking the rare equilibrium of presence and repose. Thoughts drifted naturally to the implications of unrest beyond the palace gates. Governors' reports, petitions, and strategic counsel had been weighed earlier in the day, Yet the Caliph's mind could not fully delegate awareness. Even minor disturbances could escalate. Even whispers could presage shifts in loyalty or compliance. The palace, in its protective architecture and disciplined staff, mediated these risks, yet the human element, judgment, intuition, and presence remained irreplaceable. Awareness itself became both a burden and a safeguard. You focused on the subtle variations in sound, distinguishing between routine movement and anomalies, between deliberate activity and the faint tremor of uncertainty. Each noise carried layered meaning, and the mind parsed them with practiced attention. A distant scuffle might be a guard's routine patrol, or it could hint at intrusion. A whispered conversation could be mundane housekeeping, or it could mask tension. The awareness of possibility, combined with the body's accumulated fatigue, created a strange liminality, the edge between alertness and the near dream of rest. The night deepened, shadows pooling into the corners of the chamber, yet the sounds persisted. Footsteps, murmurs, distant clinks, the rhythm of water, and occasional soft calls from guards, ensuring that routines were maintained. The whispered warning of unrest lingered, threading through the mind with a subtle, almost hypnotic insistence. Vigilance was continuous, authority unceasing. Even in the cool, quiet chamber, the empire breathed around you, alive with unseen movement and unspoken anticipation. Eventually, the body demanded stillness. The mind, trained to remain vigilant yet weary from relentless observation, began to drift between attention and rest. The sounds of the palace became a lullaby of responsibility. Each echo, each whisper, each distant footstep, a reminder of authority, presence, and the fragile balance between calm and crisis. The empire continued its quiet motion, guided invisibly by your consciousness, even as eyelids grew heavy and the final trace of wakefulness gave way to the tenuous promise of sleep. Rumors of dissent in the dark. The soft glow of lamplight barely illuminated the edges of your chamber. The night, so recently a refuge of quiet reflection, now felt heavier, threaded with tension. You had begun to accept the subtle rhythms of palace sounds, the distant fountains, hushed footsteps, the whisper of guards. But the interruption came gently, almost hesitantly. A trusted sentinel stepped forward, bowing low, his voice barely above a murmur, yet carrying the weight of necessity. "Sire, rumors have reached the eastern provinces. Nothing immediate, but there is unrest," he whispered. The words were careful, cautious, yet unmistakable. Even in the protective cocoon of the palace, the empire's pulse pressed in through these small channels, reminders that vigilance never truly paused. Fatigue tugged at your body, but your mind sharpened instantly, processing, weighing, and acknowledging the implications. Threats, even whispered, had the power to unsettle stability, erode loyalty, and ripple across distant lands. The chamber seemed to shrink in the weight of awareness. The very walls that had offered quiet reassurance now felt like a boundary between safety and the potential for disorder beyond. Servants moved nearby, sensing unease, adjusting lamps and bedding with practiced discretion. Their presence, a subtle reminder that even in private spaces, the Caliph's environment was curated for both comfort and vigilance. You could feel the day's exhaustion pressing into limbs and joints, yet it was eclipsed by the tension threading through the mind, blending concern and authority in equal measure. Your thoughts turned immediately to the provinces mentioned, to governors, tax collectors, and commanders whose loyalty, competence, and vigilance were now indirectly summoned by this quiet warning. Decisions made earlier in councils and through letters had attempted to secure stability, yet the shadow of uncertainty persisted. The reality struck with subtle clarity. Danger never truly left the Caliph's side. Even in the sanctuary of night, authority required attention, responsiveness, and discernment. The empire existed as an ever-shifting mosaic, and each rumor, however faint, demanded consideration. The guard's eyes met yours, steady and calm, yet carrying the gravity of responsibility he shared. "I will keep watch, sire. No immediate threat, but prudence suggests vigilance." His words were simple, measured, yet they crystallized the precariousness of your position. Even trust, absolute and earned over years, became a channel through which the empire's uncertainties arrived. Fatigue wavered under this renewed awareness, replaced by the sharper, more insistent alertness of concern. Servants quietly encouraged a return to rest. Bedding was smoothed, robes adjusted, and lamps softened, creating an environment meant to ease body and mind. They understood, as did you, that exhaustion was both vulnerability and necessity, yet they did not attempt to dismiss the shadow of caution threading through your consciousness. Rest had to be sought with eyes open to responsibility, a delicate negotiation between need and duty. You lay back, attempting to summon the slow rhythm of breath that had briefly brought calm, but the mind continued its measured assessment. Which provinces might require intervention? Which commanders might need support? Which rumors could signal real unrest, and which might dissipate with time? The palace itself seemed to pulse with quiet expectation, shadows stretching along walls, flickering lamplight reflecting in polished surfaces, the faint creak of wood carrying subtle reminders that vigilance was ongoing. Fear mingled with exhaustion, a dual weight pressing into shoulders, spine, and temples. The body longed for the release of sleep, yet the mind remained tethered to duty, replaying scenarios, assessing responses, and maintaining a watchful clarity. You understood that even this dark, silent hour carried political significance. Authority, perception, and readiness were inseparable from leadership, even when most intimate comfort seemed within reach. Eventually, breath slowed, muscles sagged slightly, and the servant's quiet adjustments helped cradle the body in an impression of ease. Sleep remained hesitant, elusive, yet the act of lying down, of permitting the body to release tension even partially, offered a tentative solace. The guard's watch continued. The palace whispered softly around you, and the empire persisted in its complex, unseen motions. For a fleeting moment, the Caliph could inhabit the boundary between vigilance and repose, aware that even rumors, whispered threats, and the shadow of dissent were themselves part of the enduring responsibility carried into the night. Trying to sleep as the Caliph. The chamber was dark, save for the dim glow of a single lamp left low against the far wall. Shadows stretched across tapestries, carved pillars, and polished floors, transforming familiar grandeur into a quietly oppressive presence. The bed beneath you offered comfort, yet the body's ease was overshadowed by the mind's relentless motion. Hours of counsels, prayers, consultations, and rituals had not ended in silence. Instead, they had laid a foundation for reflection, judgment, and subtle anxiety that pressed insistently upon consciousness. Even in darkness, the mind traced the threads of the empire. Decisions made earlier, some tentative, others absolute, replayed in meticulous detail. You weighed petitions from citizens, the advice of generals, governors' reports, and diplomats' subtle insinuations. Every action, every word, every signature on wax carried consequence. Minor misjudgments, overlooked signs, or misinterpreted loyalties could ripple outward, and the awareness of this responsibility made repose nearly impossible. The mind refused surrender, cataloging, calculating, anticipating, a ceaseless record of vigilance. Mistakes of the day surfaced unbidden. Slight hesitations in meetings, missed subtleties in conversation, overlooked reports. Each memory seemed magnified by the quiet of the night. You could hear the distant flow of fountains, the faint shuffle of a guard's boots along the corridor, the subtle creak of doors settling into silence. Yet these sounds did little to soothe. Instead, they reinforced the palace's pulse, a reminder that life continued beyond the chamber and that authority demanded attention even while body and spirit craved reprieve. Expectations weighed heavily, an invisible yet constant presence. Advisors, nobles, scholars, soldiers, and family all relied on the Caliph's steadiness, judgment, and example. Even small gestures carried meaning. Even in sleep, the palace, the court, and the empire expected vigilance. You understood with clarity why no caliph ever slept easily. The grandeur of life at the apex of authority was inseparable from unceasing scrutiny and responsibility. Each luxurious detail of the chamber, from embroidered cushions to polished floors, felt both protective and confining, symbols of comfort and weight alike. Your thoughts shifted to the vastness of the empire itself. Provinces spanning deserts, mountains, and seas, with governors, merchants, soldiers, and citizens, all required your attention in subtle ways. Even absent from councils, the caliph's mind acted as a connective thread, a living map of authority and expectation. The enormity of such responsibility stretched across the night, pressing the mind outward, tracing borders, evaluating loyalty, and imagining contingencies. Each scenario replayed in vivid detail, mingling concern with exhaustion. Fatigue pressed insistently against the body. Muscles heavy from hours of standing, walking, prayer, and ceremonial presence surrendered slowly to gravity. Eyelids drooped, spine sank deeper into the supportive cushions, and the rhythm of breath began to slow. The mind, though still active, softened slightly, tracing scenarios with less clarity, allowing half-formed images, half-thoughts, and fleeting memories to drift alongside urgent concerns. The palace itself seemed to respond. Lamps flickered softly shadows lengthened, and the distant murmur of night receded into quietude. Half rest arrived gradually, not full sleep, but a tenuous state of suspension. Thoughts still surfaced, sometimes sharply, sometimes as whispers at the edges of consciousness, but the body relaxed enough to permit the illusion of repose. The grandeur of the room, once oppressive, became a protective cocoon. The night's darkness, once alerting, now folded around you. The cumulative intensity of devotion, governance, ceremony, and vigilance had exhausted both flesh and mind sufficiently to allow this temporary reprieve. Outside, the first faint traces of dawn began to creep along the horizon, softening the night's darkness. Even in this liminal hour, the palace remained alive. Fountains rippled, lamps flickered in anticipation of morning, and distant footsteps hinted at attendants preparing for the day ahead. Yet within your chamber, in half rest, there was a fragile surrender, a brief, elusive intimacy with sleep. The empire, vast and unrelenting, continued its rhythm beyond the walls, while the Caliph finally, reluctantly, allowed body and spirit a moment's pause. In these fragile minutes between wakefulness and slumber, the awareness of authority persisted, but it softened enough for fatigue to anchor the mind. Decisions, expectations, and vigilance would resume with the first light of day. But now, for the first time in hours, the Caliph's body could lie heavy, partially unburdened, drifting into the tentative refuge of night's final embrace. When dawn returns and the cycle resets, the first pale fingers of dawn crept across the chamber, spilling light over polished floors, carved arches, and the carefully arranged furnishings that had witnessed the day's wait. Shadows retreated reluctantly from corners, tapestry folds, and the edges of cushions, revealing the familiar grandeur of the room in soft clarity. The chamber, still echoing with the memory of the previous day's actions, now seemed poised to receive the Caliph anew, marking the unbroken rhythm of duty that would begin again without pause. Servants stirred quietly, their movements precise and practiced. Lamps were adjusted, bedding straightened, and garments prepared, each gesture anticipating the formalities that had already begun before the sun's rise just 24 hours earlier. The palace itself seemed to awaken in concert with this delicate choreography, the floors creaking gently beneath careful steps, the fountains in distant courtyards stirring with the first light. Even the air carried subtle signs of renewal, scented faintly with incense and the distant gardens, yet charged with the inevitability of relentless expectation. You felt the familiar tug of fatigue in muscles and joints, a lingering ache from prayers, councils, audiences, and ceremonies that had spanned the previous hours. Yet awareness returned immediately. The empire did not pause for weariness, nor did authority forgive lapses in presence. Every sound, movement, and gesture within the palace demanded attention, and even the quiet approach of dawn heralded the resumption of scrutiny, responsibility, and expectation. The life of a caliph, you realized once more, left no room for escape, reprieve, or relief. Rising from bed, supported by attendants who adjusted robes and turbans with practiced care, you moved through familiar sequences as though the day had never ended. Hands washed, ablutions performed, prayers observed, all acts both spiritual and ceremonial, structured to reinforce authority, continuity, and presence. The palace itself seemed to guide each motion, its corridors, chambers, and courtyards arranged to channel ritual and governance seamlessly. Time became both immediate and infinite. The same sunrise you had greeted yesterday now demanded devotion again, unchanged in expectation, unyielding in ritual. Your mind briefly wandered to the enormity of the day ahead. The councils, petitions, letters, and audiences already waiting in distant chambers. The memory of past hours, the pressure of decisions, the scrutiny of advisors, the demands of family and scholars, the subtle tensions of diplomacy and military strategy, pressed forward with renewed clarity. Each task, however routine it might appear to outsiders, carried immense weight. Even the smallest misstep could ripple through provinces, courts, and families. And your awareness of this fact rendered sleep a fragile and fleeting refuge. The palace's rhythm enveloped you fully. Footsteps echoing in distant halls, fountains murmuring softly in the cool morning air, and the low murmur of attendants coordinating tasks with unobtrusive efficiency. The grandeur of the space, once oppressive in solitude, now reinforced authority, guiding presence and shaping ritual in every gesture. Yet alongside the beauty, the elegance, and the ceremony, there remained the persistent awareness of vigilance, duty, and unending responsibility. Standing in the courtyard, feeling the sun's first warmth brush the marble, you understood the immutable truth. The life of a caliph is a constant cycle. Prayer, counsel, diplomacy, family, governance, and reflection repeat endlessly, a sequence of expectation that allows no true pause. For anyone imagining this life from the outside, it might appear majestic, serene, or enviable, but the reality was far harsher. Even after 24 hours of relentless observation, attention, and ceremony, the body and spirit were never fully free, never fully relieved. As attendants prepared for the first councils and morning audiences, you felt the quiet lesson of the past day crystallize. Every action, every thought, every gesture carried weight. Every hour was threaded with duty. Every moment of rest, reflection, or prayer existed alongside unceasing expectation. The grandeur, the luxury, the majesty of the palace offered no immunity to fatigue, scrutiny, or the unbroken flow of responsibility. The caliph's life allowed no true pause, no retreat from vigilance, no escape from the ijki imperatives of authority. Looking across the courtyard, sunlight catching fountains and columns, you realized why no ordinary person could endure even a single day in this role, let alone a lifetime. The hours, rituals, councils, and responsibilities were a chain, linked without interruption, carrying the weight of an empire on shoulders that must remain poised, alert, and unyielding. The cycle had reset, full and relentless, and as the day began again, you understood fully the unyielding, impossible, and absolute nature of the life you carried, a life from which there was no escape, and in which the world's weight rested entirely on your presence, decisions, and vigilance.